Chapter 545. Cut the weeds and eliminate the roots. Another expert of the late stage of Sage Realm had collapsed under the pressure of Yi Zaiwen's fist. The bones of his entire body had gotten crushed, and his soul had been shattered. It may have seemed that all of these things had happened over a long duration of time. However, all of it had happened within the blink of an eye. The attack of that middle-aged expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm finally arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. His attack wasn't slow. It hadn't taken a long time to reach Yi Shiwen. However, it seemed slow compared to Yi Zaiwen's extremely fast speed. Yi Zaiwen's devil wings weren't just a magical power. They also contained a cleverly crafted agility skill that made Yi Zaiwen's attacks as fast as lightning. It took a long time to describe everything. However, Yi Shiwen had defeated these experts in an instant. Yi Shiwen didn't blink his eyes as he faced the attack of that middle-aged expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm. A scarlet screen suddenly emerged from his body and appeared in front of him. Bang! A loud sound was heard. It seemed as if the heaven and the earth had collided. This had been a terrifying collision. It had given rise to a dreadful wave which had swept out and had smashed the vast space layer by layer. Everyone saw that Yi Shiwen stood motionless in the space as the shock waves dispersed. He looked incomparably outstanding. Damn it! The complexion of that middle-aged expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm changed. He hadn't expected that such a blunder would happen because of his late response. 3 Sage experts had died within a split second. It was a big loss. Losing 3 Sage experts could be considered as a disastrous loss even for a colossal force like the dominating Heaven Dojo. There weren't many Sage experts in the universe. Moreover, it wasn't very easy to either create one or recruit one. Therefore, even the death of a single Sage expert was considered a significant loss. However, the dominating Heaven Dojo had lost 3 Sage experts in one fell swoop. The dojo lord wouldn't spare that middle-aged expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm if he returned without Yi Zaiwen's head. Kill him! The complexion of that middle-aged expert suddenly changed and he shouted. The remaining 10 experts took out their long bows and knocked their arrows. Then, they shot their arrows towards Yi Shiwen. Whiz! 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 A barrage of arrows cut through the vast space like a giant dragon and rushed towards Yi Shiwen. Those experts had attacked with their entire strength. Their arrows formed a densely packed rain of arrow in the space. Yi Shiwen coldly snorted while facing the approaching rain of arrow. Then he shouted loudly, and the sound of the shout set off countless spirit energies. They appeared like an avalanche and swept out after they had transformed into divine beams. Those arrows weren't able to approach Yi Shiwen. They had been shattered on the way by those divine beams. Whoosh! A figure penetrated through the dense rain of arrows and arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. The middle-aged expert had taken advantage of the distraction caused by those arrows and had arrived near Yi Shiwen. Boy, I will send you on your way. Damn it! You've dared to cause so much trouble for me. I will make sure that you die without a burial ground. The countenance of that middle-aged expert turned ice-cold as he looked at Yi Shiwen. He had rushed over with a dreadful real elemental energy. Consequently, a terrifying power had swept out, and this had opened numerous cracks in the void. The scene looked unusually terrifying. That expert of the Sage Great Perfection Realm was only one step away from entering Sage Accomplished Realm. He was only one step away from attaining the highest level of the Sage Realm. Such a person had attacked with his entire strength. Obviously, his strength was incredibly dreadful. Bang! Yi Shiwen stretched out his big hand and blocked the offense of that expert of the Sage Great Perfection Realm. You're very skillful. It's no wonder that you're so arrogant. However, you shouldn't have dared to oppose our young lord. You're like an ant in front of our dominating Heaven Dojo. A look of astonishment had appeared in the eyes of that middle-aged expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm. After all, he hadn't thought that Yi Shiwen would be able to stop his attack. This was completely beyond his expectations. However, soon his complexion became even more sinister, and he rushed out at an even faster speed. Then his aura burst out of his body, formed a dreadful tide, and rushed towards Yi Shiwen. He then brandished his palm. It smashed down and shattered the void. He had attacked with his entire strength this time. He hadn't held back one bit. Bang! The palm of that middle-aged expert suddenly arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. However, it got stopped by a golden wall that had been formed by the mighty golden waves under Yi Zaiwen's feet. It seemed that two big stars had collided. Both men had unleashed insane powers, and their violent collision had set off energy waves that surged everywhere. The face of that middle-aged expert finally exposed a look of terror. Earlier, he hadn't attacked with his entire strength, and his attack had been stopped by Yi Shiwen. However, he had attacked with his entire strength this time. But he still couldn't shake Yi Zaiwen's defense. In fact, his attack had seemed useless. It seemed as if a moth had thrown itself into fire. "It's my turn now." Yi Shiwen sneered. His entire vitality surged out of his body. His golden divinities surged up into incredible divine waves and swept towards that middle-aged expert. Bang! That middle-aged expert wasn't able to escape, and the attack struck him head-on. Poof! He spouted a mouthful of blood, and his body went out flying upside down. In fact, his body had nearly gotten torn into two halves. Bang! Yi Shiwen didn't stop after that middle-aged expert went out flying. Instead, he rushed after him while breaking the space. His figure transformed into a golden streamer and violently dashed forward. The tremendous repulsive force propelled Yi Shiwen forward as fast as lightning. He had covered a large distance in a flash, as if it were only a few inches. He instantly caught up with his target and formed the Hanshan seal. Bang! The Hanshan seal fell down from above like a huge mountain. The void collapsed under the immense pressure. Bang! The body of that middle-aged expert got crushed under the tremendous pressure of Yi Zaiwen's attack. The entire space turned quiet. Everyone was blankly watching this scene before their eyes. They felt like idiots. They had never imagined that this could happen. They hadn't anticipated that the situation would turn out like this. The main reason why they had arrived here was that they had wanted to curry favor with King Tai by killing Yi Shiwen. And it should have been very easy since Yi Shiwen was only an expert of the intermediate stage of Sage Realm half-year ago. Sage Realm was very difficult to reach for most of the human experts. However, it was no big deal for this group. They had brought more than a dozen Sage experts. In fact, their group even included a senior expert of the Sage Great Perfection Realm. So, no matter how formidable their target was, he wouldn't be a match for them. It was precisely because of this that they had rushed here of their own accord while striving to be the first and fearing to be last. They were willing to do anything to curry favor with their future lord, and this non-risky mission was most welcome. However, they hadn't thought that things would eventually change like this. The most powerful expert among them couldn't stop Yi Zaiwen's attack, and had gone out flying. Run away quickly! Those remaining 10 experts couldn't take it anymore. It wasn't clear who had shouted. However, everyone began to turn around to escape. They had arrived here to curry favor with King Tai. But they were indeed afraid of death. They didn't want to throw away their lives for the sake of the Doming Heaven Dojo. Their speed was quick. However, it wasn't faster than Yi Zaiwen's speed. Yi Shiwen went all out and killed them rapidly. The space once again turned quiet in a matter of moments. In fact, there was a dead silence. Yi Shiwen had obtained some information from King Tai's subordinates. So, he knew that King Tai had transformed into a streamer of light and had been shuttling through the space towards Yi Zaiwen's location. Hurry up! Hurry up! I want to tear that bastard with my own hands. King Tai fiercely said. It was hard to imagine how much hatred he possessed for Yi Shiwen. He wanted to tear Yi Shiwen into pieces and devour his flesh. He knew that Yi Shiwen had already left Great Gas Chamber of Commerce. So, he was in a hurry. Also, he knew that his subordinates would have already confronted Yi Shiwen. Therefore, he wanted to reach there even more quickly. Otherwise, his men would have already killed Yi Shiwen by the time he arrived, and his half-year-long wait would go in vain. Make sure you wait. Sure you wait for me. I will rip you apart with my own hands. King Tai said while laughing fiercely. His speed was extremely fast. He had reached that battlefield rather quickly. However, he was surprised to see that the entire scene was in a mess, and a figure was sitting upright in the center of this scene. He looked like a Buddha who had been quietly cultivating and had fused with the universe. "Boy, you didn't try to escape?" King Tai had recognized in a glance that this figure was Yi Zaiwen's. It could be said that he hated Yi Shiwen to the core. He had seen him only one time. However, he had such a deep impression of him that he could recognize him in one glance. Yi Shiwen stood up and exposed a smile from the corner of his mouth. It looked somewhat ice-cold. "I don't have the habit of putting aside danger. If there is a threat, then I must destroy it as soon as possible." Yi Shiwen had been waiting here for King Tai. He had come to know that King Tai was going to arrive here from those experts he had killed. So, he had decided that he would settle the deal with King Tai once for all right here. He already knew that King Tai was the kind of person who would take revenge even for the slightest of grievances. He hated Yi Shiwen and wanted to kill him just because he had snatched away an item from him in the auction. Such a person would do anything if left unattended. This represented the so-called saying, "Cut the weeds and eliminate the roots." It would be better to attack first and kill him instead of waiting for him to attack. "Ha! You've got some courage." King Tai furiously laughed. His ominous power shook the space in the surroundings and shattered it. "But it's fine. The heaven is helping me. Now you die." This was the ominous power of King Tai. He had acquired it when he had lived in seclusion among the demon beasts for a long time. He was also an expert of Sage Great Perfection realm. However, he and that middle-aged expert weren't on same level. There was a difference of cloud and mud between them. He looked like the king of demon beasts in this starry space. He looked incomparably ferocious. Chapter 546. King Tai shouted loudly and summoned a 2-meter-tall star beast. Its head was like that of a leopard, its body was like that of a tiger, and its tail was like that of a scorpion. Its entire body was blood red. It looked exceptionally ferocious. Yi Shiwen had seen the record of this strange star beast in the ancient books. It was the combination of 3 animals: leopard, tiger, and scorpion. It wasn't known to which species of demon beasts it belonged. All the fierce beasts of the world, like the demon beasts, the star beasts, and so on, followed a simple principle. The purer the blood, the more ferocious the beast is. The human race also followed this rule. The men who possessed the blood of the ancient humans were awfully powerful. However, this hybrid beast was clearly an exception to this rule. It looked insolent and fierce as it raised its head and roared. Its roar shook the entire surrounding space. It was incomparably dreadful. This star beast possessed an incredibly ominous dominance. It looked like the king of the beasts. It looked up and stood straight. Then, it trod with its 4 claws and ripped apart the space. This fight had attracted many experts here. A lot of experts had left for the Great Gas Collar. However, some of the experts believed that they wouldn't get any good opportunities to obtain divine treasures at the Great Gas Collar. After all, those fortuitous encounters came with brutal killings. They either believed that they didn't possess enough strength, or they believed that they didn't have good luck. Basically, they were just too ordinary. The majority of them were the experts of the Great Gas City who knew everything about the Great Gas Collar. Therefore, they didn't want to go there to throw away their lives. A lot of people had heard that King Tai had been talking about killing someone in the past 6 months. That someone had turned out to be Yi Shiwen. Now Yi Shiwen had come out, and King Tai had set out to kill him. And these people didn't wish to miss this epic confrontation. Many people had arrived here one after another. They looked from afar that the ominous energy of a star beast was boiling in space. My goodness, isn't that the hybrid beast that has been accompanying King Tai for many years now? It is said that many people had gone to suppress the group of tiger leopard scorpions after King Tai had fallen into their group. However, they had seen that this tiger leopard scorpion was calmly accompanying King Tai when they arrived there. It is said that this tiger leopard scorpion is of a different nature from birth. It is inherently bold and powerful. Of course, there's no doubt about it. It looks extremely terrifying. It seems that it can tear the world to shreds. Yi Zaiwen's complexion turned serious. This hybrid beast didn't lack in strength when compared to King Tai. In fact, This demon beast of variant origin had also reached the sage great perfection realm. It seemed that it would be very difficult to deal with it. Kill! King Tai stepped onto that hybrid beast and shouted loudly. The spirit energies of the entire space began to vibrate crazily. They vibrated and twisted. The scene looked extremely terrifying. King Tai pulled out heavenly and painted halberd and held it in his hand. It issued a dreadful charm. Yi Shiwen snorted as he saw this. Then, the golden vitality in his entire body surged out. It transformed into an energy pillar and soared up. Then that energy pillar swept all across in an overwhelming manner. There wasn't even a bit of fear on Yi Zaiwen's face as he faced King Tai, who rushed towards him like a small mountain. In fact, he felt somewhat excited deep in his heart. That expert of sage great perfection realm whom he had fought earlier was no challenge when compared to King Tai. Yi Shiwen spread out his hands at this time. Then he suddenly clenched his fists and transformed them into a big star. Then, this big star swept forward with a loud rumbling sound. Rumble! The big star collided in the sky with the halberd, and this collision issued a metal clanging sound. The tip of King Tai's halberd and Yi Zaiwen's fist pressure collided. Both of them had attacked with their entire strength. King Tai's body got swept away by a dreadful astral wind. His complexion turned slightly discolored. He hadn't thought that Yi Shiwen could be so powerful. After all, he had believed that Yi Shiwen was merely an expert of the late stage of Sage Realm, nothing more. However, Yi Shiwen was fighting with him barehanded. Moreover, it seemed that his strength was incredible, and so was his potential. In fact, it could be said that he would develop to a great extent if he was left alive. The entire starry space suddenly exploded. The spot of collision in the space had already transformed into smoke and dust. Numerous cracks had appeared even at faraway places. The complexions of those experts who had dared to arrive here to witness this fight changed as soon as they saw this. They felt that they might get to see this kind of a fight only once in their entire lifetime. However, what had shocked them the most was that this unknown boy before their eyes had turned out to be a match for King Tai. Moreover, he was fighting with King Tai unarmed. This was what King Tai used to do with others in the past. He often used to take on his opponents like a beast by relying only upon his tyrannical body. However, the situation had reversed in this instance. King Tai's complexion slightly changed. He had come across such a tough opponent for the first time in his life. His opponent was fighting with him barehanded. This meant that his body was extremely tyrannical. Perhaps, it was even more tyrannical than his. Otherwise, how could an expert of the late stage of Sage Realm fight with an expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm? You've got some trick up your sleeves? It's no wonder that you've dared to oppose me. However, it's still useless. Nobody can save you. Today you shall die. King Tai furiously said. A proud and cruel grin appeared on his face. Yi Shiwen's eyes were ice cold at the moment. King Tai possessed outstanding strength. He deserved to be one of the 4 heroes of Great Gas. He was indeed strong enough to rule among his peers. However, Yi Shiwen didn't have the slightest intention of retreating. He raised his hand and clenched his fist. He then said, I will take on whoever dares to fight with me. This day shall be your death anniversary next year. That's very audacious of you. King Tai burst into laughter as his halberd pointed towards Yi Shiwen once again. He then attacked carrying a dreadful imposing aura. He rushed forward sitting on the hybrid beast and shattered the void. And a wave of murderous aura erupted to complemented King Tai's tyranny. King Tai's halberd sketched a long imaginary shadow in the space. It suddenly issued countless halberd beams, which went flying towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen simply disregarded it. A fist swept down and transformed into a huge star. The huge star crushed everything in its path. Those halberd beams bombarded on top of this star. However, a burst of golden light suddenly appeared in that instant and annihilated those halberd beams. Consequently, the halberd beams disappeared without a trace after giving rise to a few ripples. How is it possible? King Tai didn't dare to believe what he had just seen. What is his body made of? How can it be so tough? A bad feeling appeared in his mind at this time. However, Yi Shiwen didn't give him a chance to react. And he quickly launched another attack. Each of his fists pounded like a big star. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth, and set off strong energy storms. This was the most unusual fight. Both sides had gone all out. The speed of their attacks was so quick that it had dazzled the majority of experts who had been witnessing the fight from afar. In fact, they couldn't even tell how many times these two individuals had clashed in that instant. Clang, clang, clang. The two individuals attacked each other, and metal clanging sounds were issued. However, it seemed Yi Shiwen had suppressed King Tai by using his fist alone. Bang! Suddenly, a huge explosion sounded. King Tai retreated several times in front of everyone while remaining seated atop his hybrid beast. In fact, he had nearly fallen off the hybrid beast. He spouted mouthful of blood. A big and round hole had been opened on his chest. Moreover, his metal armor had also been shattered. In fact, he would have died if that metal armor hadn't been protecting his body. King Tai stared at Yi Shiwen in a malicious manner. He hadn't paid attention to Yi Shiwen at first. He had only wanted to tear him into shreds and devour his flesh thereafter. However, he had realized how wrong he had been after he had fought with Yi Shiwen. He had always fought with everyone depending solely upon his tyrannical body. People used to say that he was a star beast in the form of a human. He had always toyed with his opponent to his heart's content. However, his strongest aspect looked extremely weak in front of Yi Shiwen. In fact, his most tyrannical aspect had been rendered useless because he had come across an opponent with a more powerful body than his own. And that was why he was suffering right now. His strongest aspect had been nullified. So, what could he depend on now? He had become aware of the terror of Yi Zaiwen's ferocious body, just like those demon beasts that had died at Yi Zaiwen's hands. His attacks couldn't shake Yi Zaiwen's defense. In fact, it seemed as if he were a golden god of war. However, Yi Shiwen hadn't even paid any attention to his defenses. Moreover, it had been his simplest of attacks that King Tai had been finding trouble coping up with. King Tai had tried very hard to injure Yi Shiwen. However, he hadn't been able to do so. On the other hand, Yi Zaiwen's casual attacks had injured him to the point of leaving him to vomit blood. "Are you okay?" King Tai's hybrid beast opened its mouth and asked. "I'm fine." King Tai clenched his teeth, and somehow suppressed the vitality that was surging inside his body. However, he still continued to spout blood because of his wounded vitality. "I'll kill him. I'll rip him to shreds." Yi Shiwen was standing in the void. He looked average and nowhere near spectacular. However, he carried a terrifying and outstanding aura. Everyone had come to feel it, especially after he had completely repulsed King Tai. King Tai looked at Yi Shiwen. His eyes were ice-cold like electricity. They were brimming with killing intention and intense hatred. Bang! King Tai lifted his halberd. The space exploded, and halberd beams swept out. His murderous aura looked boundless. Such battle prowess had surpassed the level of an ordinary expert of Sage Great Perfection realm. Everyone was terrified when they saw this. After all, such fighting strength was enough to slaughter all of them at the same time. The most powerful person among them was merely an expert of the late stage of Sage realm. After all, the experts who were stronger than the ones in this group had already entered the Great Gas Collar. It was impossible for the ordinary experts that were present here to not get terrified while witnessing such fighting strength. However, what made them even more terrified was that King Tai, who possessed such incredible fighting strength, had been forced into a disadvantageous position by Yi Shiwen. In fact, King Tai had been brutally battered by Yi Zaiwen's attacks. Moreover, he had been left exhausted and distressed. In fact, the experts who were witnessing this fight had begun to believe that Yi Shiwen was as terrifying as an ancient killing god. Kill! King Tai's murderous aura burst out. He knew that he had fallen into a disadvantageous position. However, he didn't become weak. On the contrary, his killing intention rose even higher. He then stormed towards Yi Shiwen while carrying the long halberd in his hand. He felt that he needed to seize this opportunity to kill Yi Shiwen. "It seems that you haven't understood it yet." Yi Shiwen smirked. There was no doubt that King Tai was very powerful. However, he couldn't pose any threat to him unless he was a Heaven's Pride expert of the same realm. What was a Heaven's Pride expert? They were the so-called peerless geniuses who appeared one in millions. The true martial university had a few Heaven's Pride experts among its millions of disciples. However, those millions of experts who had arrived in the true martial university were the best ones among God knows how many experts in the southern region. Moreover, even those experts had been selected from countless ordinary people. It needn't be mentioned that the southern region was so huge that it was hard to count how many people populated it. It didn't matter how big the Great Gas City was. After all, it was only a city, nothing more. It wasn't on the same level as the southern region. Chapter 547. Slaughters King Tai. Yi Shiwen possessed the fighting strength of a Heaven's Pride expert. In fact, he could be called a peerless genius among the Heaven's Pride experts. There had been several Heaven's Pride experts in the southern region in the past 100 years. In fact, the Heaven's Pride experts who had died at Yi Ziwen's hands would have become more terrifying if they had grown up to this day. King Tai might have pulled Yi Shiwen into a bitter struggle if he was also a Heaven's Pride expert. Yi Shiwen sneered. A big hand stretched out and fell down from above. It then transformed into a great seal and swept down. Bang! The great seal pounded upon King Tai's halberd. A terrifying force traveled through the halberd and charged into his body. Consequently, it became a little difficult for King Tai to hold the halberd since his palms had been cracked open to bleed. Moreover, the legs of the hybrid beast on which King Tai was sitting had also bent because of the attack. It nearly fell to its knees as a result, but its movement crushed the void underneath. King Tai had finally discovered that his martial arts accomplishment was nothing in comparison to Yi Shiwen. Moreover, there was a huge disparity in his level of martial Dao achievement as well. The disparity wasn't as big as the disparity between humans and ants. However, it was as much as the difference between cloud and mud. It could also be compared to the disparity between an infant and a sturdy adult. Now that blood rain killing demon, King Tai roared. He urged out the entire real elemental energy in his body. After all, he needed to turn the tide in his favor at any cost. And he had to go all out for this. There was no other option. His aura began to surge up, and the void in the periphery got distorted in its entirety. The lower half of his body transformed into a pool of blood, and that hybrid beast got integrated into it. Consequently, his fighting strength suddenly turned up a notch. Damn it. Boy, I'm not willing to accept that I can't kill you. I am the best. I'm the head of the 4 heroes of Great Gas. Who do you think you are to be challenging me? King Tai's real elemental energy burst out and disintegrated the void. The unleashed energy contained an incredible divine power. Yi Ziwen's complexion turned slightly cold while facing King Tai's sudden outbreak. However, his gaze seemed simply unaffected. The page of ancient god scripture flew out behind him. It seemed as if he was reading the god scripture that had been passed down since ancient times. A divine beam burst out and dyed Yi Ziwen's entire figure golden. He now looked like a golden god of war. It's useless. You're no match for me. What 4 heroes of Great Gas? It's laughable. Yi Shiwen coldly replied. He didn't care about the Great Gas 4 heroes. He would have crushed them like ants if he possessed the same cultivation time as them. He wasn't scared of the Great Gas 4 heroes. However, he would be somewhat wary if the forces backing them attacked him. Yi Ziwen's fist transformed into a big star, fell down, and struck King Tai's body. King Tai clenched his teeth and suddenly released an incredible scarlet light from his body. The scarlet light transformed into a sky-devouring blood beast. In fact, it looked like an ancient beast from the legends that could swallow the stars. It then suddenly rushed up to attack. Rumble! Yi Ziwen's big star transformed into numerous swordlights as he faced this dreadful insurrection. And that blood beast got cut into 2 halves on the spot. The beast transformed into an astral wind in the void, and was then swept away like a mighty wave. King Tai had nearly transformed into a fierce beast during this attack. Moreover, countless scales had grown over his body. Suddenly, the scarlet halberd streaked through the vast space. It carried an invincible ominous energy and instantly arrived in front of Yi Shiwen to kill him. King Tai's muscles began to rupture. It was evident that he couldn't maintain this beastly form for long. Blood splashed out from his body, and he transformed into a blood man. In addition, his complexion turned exceptionally fierce. Half of the reason for this transformation was his immense hatred for Yi Shiwen, while the other half was his unbearable pain which had converted into immense power. This was to be his last as well as most powerful strike. A sword appeared in Yi Zaiwen's palm. He then slashed with it. The strike transformed into a sword light and swept out. It rushed towards that scarlet halberd. Buried Heaven Sword. Yi Shiwen had already mastered the sword technique of Buried Heaven Sword to the bone. So, even his single effortless sword strike was able to unleash a dreadful amount of power. Bang! King Tai's strength had reached its zenith, and it seemed that he would break the world. However, Yi Zaiwen's strength was still more formidable. King Tai's body got blown away by Yi Shiwen once again. Moreover, his body was being torn apart by Yi Zaiwen's horrifying power. In fact, it had nearly been ripped apart by now. Yi Shiwen streaked across the space and instantly arrived in front of King Tai. The incredible magical prowess of Devil Wings had manifested to the extreme. Yi Shiwen stretched out his hand. It suddenly transformed into an exceptionally huge seal and slammed down on King Tai. Everyone was stunned as they witnessed the scene before their eyes. King Tai's strength had been insane before he had transformed, and his strength had increased by a notch after transforming into a beast. However, he still hadn't been able to stand his ground in front of Yi Shiwen. Moreover, he had been routed very effortlessly. This showed that Yi Shiwen was far too powerful. It's over. King Tai is done for. He looks like an infant in front of this man even after unleashing his utmost power. He's far inferior to this man. They aren't on the same level. It's a pity. King Tai is a peerless genius of our great gas city. He might have had the opportunity to enter the great sage realm in the future. However, he is going to fall here. King Tai always bullies others by abusing the power of the dominating Heaven Dojo. So, it is a good thing that he's going to die now. This man is reckless and unruly. He has dared to resort to extreme methods against King Tai. The dominating Heaven Dojo isn't going to leave this matter be. This will shake the entire Great Gas City. Most of the spectators didn't have a favorable opinion of King Tai's chances. After all, King Tai didn't have anything that could give these people even a bit of hope about his chances against Yi Zaiwen's unimaginable strength. A furious shout came from the Great Gas City. All the spirit energies gathered in the surroundings suddenly scattered like clouds. Then, a big hand swept out from the Great Gas City. It ripped through the vast space and rushed towards the battlefield. This attack carried immensely dreadful strength and the power of boundless principles. Its might couldn't be matched. And this development instantly left everyone terrified. Great Sage. This scary Great Sage coercion made a lot of experts weak in the knee. They didn't dare to disobey. After all, this was the true power of Great Sage. There would be no suspense about the outcome if an ordinary Sage expert clashed with a Great Sage expert. It would be impossible for ordinary Sage experts to contend against a Great Sage expert because they weren't on the same level as a Great Sage expert. This is dominating Heaven Dojo's Lord. Yi Shiwen felt that overwhelming imposing aura. Moreover, the killing intention was hardly concealed. In fact, it seemed that it would engulf him whole. Yi Shiwen snorted. This dominating Heaven Dojo's Lord must have been observing King Tai since the beginning. He must have been considering Yi Shiwen as King Tai's whetstone. Therefore, he hadn't done anything so far. However, he had now seen that King Tai had fallen into a disadvantageous position. Moreover, he was also about to die at Yi Zaiwen's hands. So, he couldn't stop himself from attacking. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't the kind of person who would leave the root of the trouble behind. King Tai's personality wouldn't allow him to be grateful to Yi Shiwen if Yi Shiwen didn't kill him. Instead, he would harbor a grudge against him and would think about methods to kill him. Bang! King Tai screamed as his body got crushed by Yi Shiwen. Then, his body transformed into a mass of blood fog. And his soul got shattered. You have a death wish. The dominating Heaven Dojo's lord became infuriated when he saw his beloved disciple being killed. He had been nurturing King Tai for many years so that he could succeed him. He had put mental and physical efforts for many years to nurture King Tai, and had made him one of the 4 heroes of Great Gas. Moreover, King Tai was expected to become a great sage in the future. However, the entirety of his efforts had gone in vain since King Tai had been killed by Yi Shiwen. Everything had gone in vain. So, he would now have to spend several hundred years more to cultivate another person. And this new talent still might not be able to achieve King Tai's level of strength. Moreover, the other 3 heroes of Great Gas would have grown to God knows what extent till then. This was the most awful thing that could have happened. A dreadful imposing aura soared in the space above the Great Gas City. And a silhouette carrying a boundlessly evil aura swept towards the battlefield. His big hand had already ripped through the vast space and was coming towards Yi Shiwen to grab him. It seemed that it would soon crush Yi Shiwen to death. Whoosh! Yi Ziwen's speed was extremely quick. He transformed into a golden flash in an instant and moved several hundred kilometers away. Bang! The place where Yi Shiwen had stood a moment ago exploded. The space collapsed, and chaos leaked out from it. Then the space exploded. It was like the aftermath of Doomsday. It looked insanely terrifying. Yi Shiwen would have been crushed to death if he hadn't escaped so quickly. After all, he was merely an expert of the late stage of Sage Realm. Therefore, he differed from the Great Sage by several realms. So, he could have gotten crushed to death very easily. The disparity between Sage Realm and Great Sage Realm was bigger than the disparity between Legendary Realm and Sage Realm. In fact, there was a difference of cloud and mud between them. They were simply not on same level. Boy, you will die. I won't let you off. The Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo roared like an injured beast. He had entered Great Sage Realm many years ago. And nobody had ever dared to act like this against him till now. In addition, everyone used to pay respect to his disciples wherever they went. Nobody had ever dared to resort to extreme methods against his disciples. He had nurtured his successor for so many years. However, that would-be successor was now dead. So, it was certain that he would go insane and harbor an enormous grievance against his would-be successor's killer. It was hard to imagine how fast a great sage's attack could be. After all, this great sage's attack had crossed an enormous chunk of space in an instant to arrive close to the battlefield. Yi Shiwen had felt that an aura that initially had been very far away had arrived close to him in an instant. A great sage expert was very scary. However, it wasn't that Yi Shiwen didn't know this. After all, he had made a narrow escape from the hands of a great sage expert of the Fire Cloud Cave in the past. He had been attacked several times that day, but he had still managed to escape. His strength had certainly increased significantly from back then. However, he knew that he was still far from being a match for a ferocious expert of the Great Sage Realm. Therefore, he immediately opened his devil wings, transformed into a streamer of light, and flew into the distance. Chapter 548. Bang! 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 A golden streamer was randomly shuttling around in the space at a great speed. And a big hand was unceasingly pressing down from above. The big hand shattered the space and transformed it into a mass of chaos every time it pressed down. It appeared as if this big hand was giving birth to a new world each time it slammed down. Ah! Yi Shiwen heard the roar of the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo coming from behind him. The spiritual power contained in that big hand was tightly locked on his body. His pair of golden wings fluttered faster and faster. Great sage experts were extremely ferocious. They could cover 1,000 miles in a single step. Their incredible speed was simply beyond anyone's imagination. It would be useless for an ordinary sage expert even if they tried to escape as fast as possible. A great sage could catch up with them in an instant. However, Yi Shiwen was no ordinary sage expert. Moreover, his speed would become very high whenever Head used his devil wings. In fact, Head looked like a golden lightning when Head used his devil wings. This was how he had managed to escape from the hands of a great sage expert even when he only possessed the strength of semi-sage level. However, he was considered a super expert in sage realm now. It wasn't clear how much his strength had increased. Moreover, his devil wings had reached a whole new level as well. He had been chased non-stop by a great sage expert in the past. In fact, he had come close to being grasped on several occasions. However, his speed had become even faster now. The rage of the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo had soared. He roared again and again. However, he couldn't catch Yi Shiwen. He was missing to catch him by a bit every time. Yi Zaiwen's present attitude was much more calm and confident as compared to when he had been chased by that great sage expert of the Fire Cloud Cave. However, the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo chased Yi Shiwen continuously. He wasn't willing to give up. It seemed that he wouldn't spare Yi Shiwen even if he had to pursue him to the end of the world. It felt that he would definitely tear him to shreds since he had killed his beloved disciple. Yi Shiwen, quickly go towards the great gas collar. He won't go in there. Yi Mo promptly reminded. Yi Shiwen nodded. However, Yi Mo didn't need to say that since Yi Shiwen had already been flying in the direction of the great gas collar. Yi Shiwen had slaughtered King Tai. So, the Lord of Dominating Heaven Dojo wasn't going to spare him. In fact, it seemed that he would pursue him to the world's edge. The devil wings were too awesome, and he didn't need to stop even for a bit. However, he didn't wish to spend his remaining life being chased like this. Therefore, he could go only in the direction of the great gas collar since the great sage experts didn't dare to enter that place. However, the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo made out Yi Zaiwen's intentions soon enough. And he flew into a rage when he figured out that Yi Shiwen wanted to enter the great gas collar. He would escape if I let him enter the great gas collar. And I won't be able to take revenge on this vile murderer who has killed my disciple. Therefore, he tried to increase his speed. However, his speed had already reached to its limit. So, his speed didn't increase further no matter how much he tried. And he kept falling short of Yi Shiwen by an inch every time as a result. He had obviously become furious. He didn't know what kind of agility technique Yi Shiwen possessed that had enabled an ordinary sage expert like him to escape from the hands of a great sage expert. This seemed like a big miracle which would shake the entire starry space if declared publicly. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo roared again and again. However, he couldn't catch Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen looked like a golden streamer that was far too fast. Moreover, it seemed that his momentum and power weren't reducing with time. Yi Zaiwen's foundation was very deep. And his real elemental energy was even more profound. Even an expert of sage great perfection realm might not have such profound cultivation. So, it wasn't clear how long it would take for his energy to exhaust. In fact, he had all kinds of spirit dawn for replenishing his real elemental energy. He had certainly consumed a huge amount of primary spirit dawn in these 6 months. However, a huge amount of it was still left in his stock. In addition, he also had a lot of medicinal pills in his stock for replenishing his real elemental energy. So, it was basically impossible for him to exhaust the entirety of his resources. A lot of people were on the trajectory to the Great Gas Collar from Great Gas City. They saw that a flustered-looking senior great sage expert was chasing an ordinary sage expert in exasperation. The sound of his roar surged up like thunder and shook the surroundings. A chunk of the space collapsed every time the big hand slammed down. The scene looked extremely dreadful. It was hard to tell how many people had been affected by this chase so far. After all, the mere aftershocks from this chase had injured many sage experts. Bang! Both men had reached the borderline of the Great Gas Collar. The Great Gas Collar looked different from earlier when it had been blockaded by the poisonous gas. Now, it had finally revealed a bit of its true appearance. However, some areas still had a weak presence of the poisonous fog. The ordinary people in these areas were able to enter the Great Gas Collar. However, the collar looked like a giant continent. Whoosh! Yi Shiwen suddenly arrived while streaking across the space like a golden streamer, and vanished into the great gas collar without even stopping for a moment. Roar! The sound of the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo's furious roar reverberated behind him. He had gone mad in rage since Yi Shiwen had escaped. Yi Shiwen had entered the great gas collar. So, the dojo lord couldn't pursue him any further. Phew! Yi Shiwen let out a sigh of relief. He had planned how he would escape if he were to come across a great sage expert. However, he heaved a sigh of relief after having executed that plan. There is a difference of heaven and earth between Great Sage Realm and Sage Realm. They simply aren't on the same level. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo is just at the initial stage of Great Sage Realm. However, he is as awe-inspiring as a god. Yi Shiwen said this. He still had a lingering fear in his heart. A great sage-level expert was far more powerful than what he had imagined. He will definitely send people to blockade this great gas collar. He won't let you escape very easily. Yimo warned. The great gas collar was very big. However, it wasn't impossible for these super experts to blockade it. Yi Shiwen developed a headache as he thought all this. An ordinary sage expert would certainly be screwed if he got chased by a great sage expert who was dead set on not letting him go. Therefore, this was only a temporary escape. He would still have to face him later. However, it's not impossible to deal with it. Yimo sneered and said, "You speed up the process of refining the soul of the Star Colossus. Your blood slave can grow up quickly to the initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm that way. And it will be able to display the might of Great Sage level by controlling the corpse of the Star Colossus once it's there." Yi Shiwen wasn't the only one who had made a fast progress. Yi Shiwen had surely made the breakthrough into the late stage of Sage Realm, but that blood slave had already reached the Sage Accomplished Realm. In fact, it had made much quicker progress than Yi Shiwen. The blood slave itself was formed by absorbing the Star Colossus soul. Therefore, the so-called bottleneck, realization of realm, and so on didn't matter for the blood slave since its growth was based on direct borrowing. Its cultivation increased by absorbing the Star Colossus. So, the quicker it would absorb, the faster it would progress. The blood slave could now display the strength of the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm when it controlled the corpse of the Star Colossus. However, its body would become even more tyrannical than Yi Zaiwen's with the aid of the Star Colossus if it itself could progress to the initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. And it could contend against the experts of initial stage of Great Sage Realm at that time. However, it was easier said than done. The blood slave wouldn't need to enter the Great Sage Realm. However, half-step Great Sage Realm still had those two words in it, Great and Sage. So, it was still very challenging. Fortunately, the blood slave didn't have to face any realm barrier. Therefore, the task could be accomplished as long as the rate of absorption was accelerated. Anyway, I've shaken off this guy for now. Yi Shiwen ignored the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo as he continued to roar in the background. Yi Shiwen then rushed inside. "Brother, please wait for a moment." A crisp yet elegant voice came from behind. Yi Shiwen turned around to see an approximately 20 years old woman. Her skin was as fair as snow. Her eyes looked like pools of limpid autumn water as they flickered like the stars in the sky. Her fine black hair hung over her shoulder, and an ivory silk long skirt outlined her graceful body. In addition, she had draped another watercolored slim-fit robe which had embroidery of light cyan threads at the collar and cuffs. She wore a pair of shoes which were also cyan in color, and each of those shoes had a light pink lotus embroidered over them. The lotuses looked prominent yet elegant. Yi Shiwen frowned as he saw that woman slowly emerging from the void. He also became a bit vigilant since he had discovered that this woman possessed the strength of Sage Great Perfection Realm. In fact, she was no less than King Tai. "What's the matter?" Yi Shiwen asked. "Please forgive this younger sister for being presumptuous. This younger sister is Ding Tong. I've just seen your outstanding might. Even a great sage expert was unable to deal with you. I would like to invite you to join our team." The woman, Ding Tong, faintly smiled and replied. "You saw that?" Yi Shiwen frowned and looked at Ding Tong. His eyes flashed a few times. He suddenly became vigilant in his heart. The Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo couldn't come here. However, it didn't mean that no one from the Dominating Heaven Dojo could come here. There were a lot of experts in the Dominating Heaven Dojo. Some of them had even reached Sage Accomplished Realm. And he believed that those Sage Accomplished level experts wouldn't let him off if they found him. In fact, they wouldn't rest until they had hunted him down. The experts of Sage Accomplished Realm weren't as powerful as the experts of Great Sage Realm. However, Yi Shiwen still couldn't contend against them unless he took out the Blood Slave while it was controlling the Star Colossus. However, he reckoned that the Blood Slave would get affected by the Great Gas Collar if he took it out here. It would then get ganged up and destroyed by his enemies. After all, the Great Gas Collar didn't allow anyone with the strength above the Sage Realm to enter its boundaries. Yi Shiwen would still manage to escape. However, it would be very troublesome. Don't misunderstand me. We and the Dominating Heavens Dojo aren't together. In fact, we don't even belong to the Great Gas City. Ding Tong explained. She was afraid that Yi Shiwen had misunderstood her. After all, she had seen him escaping from the hands of the Lord of the Dominating Heaven Dojo just now. She clearly knew how much the difference between Sage Realm and Great Sage Realm was. However, Yi Shiwen had escaped from the hands of a great sage expert. So, he had to be a famous person. In fact, he had to be a top player in the Sage Realm. Moreover, it was also clear that Yi Shiwen was a fierce person. Therefore, it would be very bad for her if she messed up and he misunderstood her for a disciple of the Dominating Heaven Dojo. Our team isn't from the River Shore Star Field. We have come from another star field. We have arrived at Great Gas Collar in order to make some profit. Would you like to join us? Ding Tong asked. Yi Shiwen raised his eyebrows. He was very familiar with the method of such small groups. There was advantage as well as disadvantage in joining them. The advantage was that it would be safer to operate in a group of people inside the Great Gas Collar. However, the disadvantage was that one might die if the other group members had evil intentions. However, Yi Shiwen didn't care about this. Even an expert of Sage Accomplished Realm couldn't stop him from escaping. Anyway, he hadn't gotten the time to collect information regarding the Great Gas Collar because of King Tai. So, he could also obtain some information by joining this team. Yi Shiwen nodded after he had thought this. Very well then. Chapter 549. The two individuals didn't hesitate and flew towards the depths of the Great Gas Collar after Yi Shiwen had agreed. I have invited you so presumptuously because there's a tomb in the depths of the Great Gas Collar. It is said that this place contains a secret that can help a sage expert to enter the Great Sage Realm. Ding Tong explained. Yi Shiwen raised his eyebrows. A bright light glittered in his eyes. The Sage Realm was an extravagant hope for the majority of experts. However, every sage expert wanted to enter the Great Sage Realm. Sage experts could merely defend themselves in the starry space. However, great sage experts were considered the powerhouses of the starry space. In fact, they were capable enough of reigning over a region. The Great Sage Realm could be attained easily by the experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm and Sage Accomplished Realm. However, the star field was like a natural barrier. So, it was much more difficult to make the breakthrough into the Great Sage Realm in the star field as compared to on a planet. The promotion from the legendary realm to the Sage Realm could be said to cause the transformation of body. However, the promotion from Sage Realm to Great Sage Realm led to the transformation of soul by this analogy. And this transformation would be completed only after one had entered the Great Sage Realm. However, many people have obtained this news. So, a chaotic fight between exceptional heroes is imminent. Therefore, we hope to find as many experts as possible for support. Ding Tong said. Yi Shiwen nodded. Countless people would have gone crazy if there was indeed a method to enter the Great Sage Realm. Moreover, those who have dared to enter the Great Gas Collar are undoubtedly super experts of the Sage Realm. And all of them would love to enter Great Sage Realm. It is said that someone had obtained this treasure the last time this Great Gas Collar had opened. And that person reached the Great Sage Realm very quickly after going out of the Great Gas Collar. Ding Tong added. Therefore, many experts would be arriving for this secret this time. In fact, our team also has a lot of experts. I hope Brother Yi will join hands with me in the fight when the time comes. Ding Tong glanced at Yi Shiwen with her sparkling eyes and said. Yi Shiwen suddenly felt that something wasn't right. What kind of a situation is this? This Ding Tong obviously doesn't trust the people of her own group. Moreover, she wants an outsider like me to join her in the fight. Isn't it kind of funny? It's evident how wary they are of each other. It's no wonder that they've dared to add more people to the group. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but become more vigilant after having thought this. Yi Shiwen had known that the situation at the Great Gas Collar was going to be complicated. However, it was much more complicated than what he had imagined. He might fall into someone's trap if he were not careful. However, Yi Shiwen didn't think much about it at this time. And this was probably related to that secret which could help people to enter the Great Sage Realm. Yi Shiwen couldn't let this opportunity slip out of his hands. After all, his journey to the Great Sage Realm would become much simpler if he managed to obtain this secret. He knew nothing about this so-called secret. Therefore, it would be better for him to follow this team and obtain some concrete information first. Moreover, those people who might scheme against him must know that he was no fool. Only the time would tell who schemed against whom. We must not delay in that case. We must rush over there. Yi Shiwen said. Then, both individuals quickly disappeared into the horizon. Both of them were outstanding experts in the Sage Realm. It was hard to tell how many miles they had traveled within the blink of an eye. They had arrived inside a mountain valley after about half-day's time. The Great Gas Collar was very famous for being a dangerous place. Violent auras of extremely fierce demon beasts could be felt everywhere. They would have had to fight with several beasts if Yi Shiwen hadn't sensed them in advance. Neither of them was afraid of those demon beasts. However, they wanted to avoid needless confrontations since they would have delayed them. The entire Great Gas Collar was full of dangers. It looked like a prehistoric great ancient continent from the fables. Wild auras of demon beasts were lurking everywhere. They were present in large numbers and had formed a kingdom. This kingdom had an army. It seemed as if it was a country of demon beasts. The situation was very dreadful. They individually couldn't cause a threat to the elite human experts. However, they seemed terrifying when they appeared in groups. We will wait for them here. Our team had only a few people at first. But those few people had gone to look for helpers afterwards. And I happened to be the first one to return among them. Ding Tong said. This place is full of demon beasts. This place is more terrifying than a desolate wilderness. Moreover, I have means to escape from an expert of Sage Great Perfection realm when it comes to one-on-one confrontation. However, it will be better to stay as far away as possible from that army of demon beasts. Yi Shiwen didn't say anything in response. An ordinary person must stay as far as possible from such an army of demon beasts. After all, one individual may be able to fight with 10 or even 100 beasts. However, an ordinary expert surely couldn't fight with 1,000 demon beasts. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't ordinary. He was capable of fighting with 1,000 demon beasts. So, he wasn't afraid of fighting with a huge group even if he was alone. After all, he had Phoenix regeneration technique to protect his body. So, he could recover from his injuries in an instant using this technique. Moreover, he had already perfected his tyrant body to the 7th layer. So, it wasn't that easy to injure him. Ding Tong had keenly noticed Yi Ziwen's silence to her remarks of caution. However, she maintained her composure. After all, it was normal for the powerful experts to be a bit arrogant. Moreover, this person had managed to escape from the hands of a great sage expert. She wouldn't have believed that this man who looked like an ordinary expert of the late stage of Sage Realm had escaped from the hands of a great sage expert if she hadn't seen it with her own eyes. In fact, she would have considered it a fairy tale if she had heard about this matter from someone. One would think that Yi Shiwen was unfathomable if they had seen him at that time. One couldn't tell what his background was. Yi Shiwen suddenly wrinkled his brows as he looked into the distance. A demon beast is peeping on us. Yi Shiwen coldly smiled and said, "It's acting recklessly." Ding Tong was left dumbstruck as Yi Shiwen told her this. So, she swept out her divine sense. And she found a spot in the space to be somewhat strange, and immediately became scared as a result. After all, they were about to gather at this place and a demon beast was spying here. This was a bad omen. It was possible that a force of demon beasts had been keeping watch here, and was planning to launch an ambush after they had come to know that these people were about to gather here. Moreover, it was also possible that the demon beast which was spying on them was merely a pawn that had arrived here to confirm the news. In any case, it wasn't good news for them. Meanwhile, Yi Shiwen was about to attack. Bang! Suddenly, the entire sky began to tremble, and cracks opened up in the space. Startling divine beams surged down from the sky. Then, those enormous and powerful beams bombarded at that spot in the space. A scream sounded, and a demon beast fell down from the void. It had been blasted into two halves by the direct bombardment. Two figures came from afar treading on flying lights immediately after that. They had made a flashy entrance. They seemed to have traveled several hundred miles. Yi Shiwen condensed the real elemental energy in his eyes, and saw through the light that had filled the entire sky. He saw the figures of a man and a woman. The man stood in front. His imposing aura appeared like a mighty tide. He looked impressive, and his outstanding appearance seemed heroic. He possessed a kind of innate, outstanding bearing. He seemed to be entirely different from a secretive kind of person like Yi Shiwen. They seemed to have two very different styles. A person could tell that this man was powerful by merely looking at him. On the other hand, one had to stay with Yi Shiwen for some time to recognize the extent of his strength. So, this man was entirely different from Yi Shiwen. The woman behind him was exactly the opposite. She wore a red dress that couldn't conceal her perfect figure. In addition, her perfect face carried an alluring and lovely appearance. One would feel a thrill deep in their bones if they shot a glance at her. Gee, didn't I say that you're too careless, Ding Tong? That demon beast had been observing our meeting spot. What would we have done if Brother Gu Tian hadn't attacked in time and that beast had spread the information? That alluring red-clothed woman scolded Ding Tong as soon as she arrived. Yi Shiwen shot a glance at Ding Tong and found that her complexion had darkened. It was clear that she didn't have a good relation with this woman. This is the helper I've found, Gu Tian. He is currently at Sage Great Perfection level and is only one step away from entering Sage Accomplished Realm. He has arrived at Great Gas Collar in order to make the breakthrough. He will strive for a position among the top 10 individuals of Great Gas Building when the time comes. The charming red-clothed woman looked at that impressive man as she said, "Gee, this wouldn't be the helper that you found, right? Ding Tong, we're going to that tomb. There shall be dangers everywhere in that place. So, it would be a joke to take along an expert of the late stage of Sage Realm. He will only get tortured to death over there." The red-clothed woman shot a glance at Yi Shiwen and made out his cultivation level. Then she said somewhat disdainfully, "These people were at the Sage Great Perfection Realm. Only Yi Shiwen was at the late stage of Sage Realm. So, he stood out among these people in a way. However, he looked prominently weak to be precise. The experts of late stage of Sage Realm weren't weak. In fact, they were famous even in the starry space. They could be sent to some remote star fields as ancestors without a problem. However, Yi Shiwen looked very weak in front of these three experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm. There's no problem if he himself gets killed. However, I'm afraid that he will drag us down with him. Do you think that this is a child's play that anyone can come and join?" The red-clothed woman disdainfully looked at Yi Shiwen. She looked deep into his eyes. She had hoped to see him all flustered and exasperated, and flying into a rage. However, she was surprised to see him calm and composed. It seemed that he either didn't mind her words, or had ignored them completely. "Yi Shiwen, this is my comrade, Xiao Yuan. Ding Tong's complexion soon restored to normal. However, she was unceasingly sneering in her mind. You will surely come to know who's being funny when you experience how ferocious he is. This is the helper I've found, Yi Shiwen. This is the helper you found? It's laughable. It would have been better if you had returned empty-handed instead of finding someone like this." Xiao Yuan rudely laughed. However, she realized that she had embarrassed herself because both the people whom she had ridiculed hadn't paid any attention to her. In fact, the way they had ignored her had left her to look like a clown. Consequently, a bitter look flashed in her eyes. Suddenly, another burst of divine rays flashed in the sky, and several figures came over flying. Chapter 550. A man stepped down from the flying light. He was dressed in yellow clothes. Ding Tong's voice rang in Yi Zaiwen's ears. She had transmitted her voice to Yi Zaiwen's brain using a secret sound transmission technique. He is Yurei. He's the core disciple of the famous Seven Luminaries Divine School, which is located in the River Shore Star Field. Yi Shiwen recalled that there was a school of this name in the River Shore Star Field. It was more powerful than the dominating Heaven Dojo. But it couldn't be compared with a giant force like the true Martial University. However, it was still a dominant party in the River Shore Star Field. This man's cultivation was as good as Gu Tian's. In fact, it seemed a bit more powerful than his. Yi Shiwen could feel a suppressive force impacting his heart even though this man stood far away. The man carried an arrogant expression on his face. It seemed as if he was disdainfully overlooking the world. Another man arrived immediately after him. He was short in stature and had prominent features. He looked unusually ugly. However, he was dressed in magnificent snow-white clothes. It seemed as if he was pretending to be an elegant young master, as if a monkey had worn a crown. He looked ridiculous. Moreover, Yi Shiwen noticed that his legs looked weird. That man had concealed his legs well. However, Yi Shiwen had noticed them at a glance. However, Yi Shiwen didn't dare to underestimate him since his vigor and spirit were far more tyrannical than that of the yellow-clothed man. Moreover, his fundamental aura was randomly surging around. This man had already reached the peak of the Sage Great Perfection realm, and was only one step away from entering Sage Accomplished realm. Then, he would become a formidable person who would stand at the top of the Sage realm. He also had a blazing and ominous look in his eyes. This is Gong Yanjia. He's a major disciple of the Hidden Fantasy sect. It is a major sect in another star field. He's the strongest among the four of us. However, his temperament is very violent. And he hates it when people talk about his looks, or call him a cripple. You must also be careful about this. Ding Tong's voice reverberated in Yi Zaiwen's mind. Two men and a woman arrived immediately after them. One of those two men was dressed in a black robe, while the other wore a white robe. Both of them looked skinny and had wretched facial features. Their appearance was very similar. It was obvious that they were twins. That woman was dressed in a black dress. She had a very cold bearing. It seemed as if she was emitting a chill from her body in order to keep everyone 1,000 miles away from her. She appeared to be indifferent towards everyone. Brother Yu, Brother Gong Yan, how come you're so slow? My junior sister and I have been waiting for you for so long. The red-clothed woman Xiao Yuan delicately smiled and said, she herself had only recently arrived. However, it didn't appear so from her words. Would you not introduce these three people to us? Fufufu. Such a beautiful girl. We, the cultivators of yin and yang, had been looking for such a fine human cauldron for a long time, but we couldn't find any. The white-robed old man among those twins let out an evil laughter as he said. He looked at Xiao Yuan with an avaricious expression in his eyes. It seemed as if he wanted to swallow her whole. Indeed, elder brother. The black-robed old man also laughed sinisterly. What do you say, young girl? Marry my elder brother, and I can assure you that you will have the taste of being on the seventh heaven. Your cultivation will also advance by leaps and bounds. Sage Accomplished realm will only be a matter of time for you. These two old men had started to unscrupulously harass Xiao Yuan immediately after they had arrived. Yi Shiwen had an incredible insight. So, he had seen through these two old men. They are probably walking on the path of dual cultivation. However, the evil energy soaring on their bodies makes it evident that they aren't walking on the correct path. Dual cultivation wasn't some depraved way. Instead, it was an upright and straightforward path of displaying one's strength and discipline. The legend of the Yellow Emperor who had become an immortal overnight by having sex with 100 females had been passed down for generations. The Taoist teaching also had a proper path of dual cultivation, and Buddhism had the so-called joyous way of meditation. So, it could clearly be seen that the path of dual cultivation wasn't some corrupt method. The monks paid particular attention to land, companion, principle, and wealth. Among these, the word companion referred to both mates and friends in one's life. So, it also contains the idea of dual cultivation within. However, every cultivator of dual cultivation path wasn't decent and righteous. There were many corrupt cultivators as well. Their dishonest ways would improve upon using this cultivation method. It also helped them in getting faster results. On the other hand, the honest and straightforward path of dual cultivation was all about long-term approach. Moreover, both the parties involved could benefit from it. On the contrary, the evil way of dual cultivation was often predatory in nature. One party would be withered to death after their primary essence had been entirely plundered by another party. These two men were clearly the dual cultivators of the evil way. In fact, one could tell that they weren't good people just by looking at them. Yi Shiwen carefully looked at Xiao Yuan once again. He found that she was an owner of the so-called inborn charming bone. This kind of constitution wasn't commonly seen in humans. This physique was very suitable for walking on the path of dual cultivation. One would make a rapid progress no matter whether they followed the correct way of cultivation or the evil way of cultivation. This method was outstanding. It was no wonder that these two old men were this interested in Xiao Yuan. After all, the rapid progress of their evil cultivation would no longer be a fantasy if they could use her as a human cauldron. However, Xiao Yuan wasn't aware of their ulterior motives. She only thought that they were old perverts. So, she looked at them in a very disgusted way. "Fuck off, you old motherfuckers." Xiao Yuan became furious. She took a valiant stance and didn't show even a trace of weakness. "It will be better if the both of you behave yourself. Otherwise, I won't mind killing a few people in advance." Gu Tian stepped out and warned those two old men. He was the helper whom Xiao Yuan had brought along. He was a discerning person who could easily see their intentions for Xiao Yuan. And he couldn't let those old men do whatever they wanted. "Kill us? Fufu. Pretty boy, you're very courageous." The white-robed old man stared maliciously at Gu Tian and said, "A bunch of ugly freaks." Gu Tian retorted disdainfully. His voice hadn't faded when a shrill sound of breaking of space was heard. A figure suddenly arrived in front of him and threw a kick at him. Bang! The kick carried the impact of the end of the world. It formed a huge picture of the end of the world and swept towards Gu Tian to shroud him. The air in the entire surrounding area froze. It was a scary sight. However, Gu Tian's reaction wasn't slow either. His cultivation of sage great perfection realm wasn't just for show. He shouted loudly, and his hands crisscrossed in order to resist the attack. Bang! The entire space sunk by that kick which had come straight from the end of the world. A sound of crunch was heard immediately afterwards. Gu Tian let out a stuffed groan and got blown away. He then spouted a mouthful of blood. His hands softly hung down since they had been mangled by that kick. Everyone couldn't help but hold their breaths. They were stunned as they saw the scene before their eyes. All of them were proud and arrogant experts. However, they became scared as soon as they saw this scene. Gu Tian's strength wasn't lacking. He was a top expert of the sage great perfection realm. However, both of his hands had been broken by a single kick. The tyrannical strength of this kick had made them scared. At this time, that figure finally emerged. It turned out to be Gong Yanjia. His expression looked ice-cold as he looked at Gu Tian with his gloomy and cold eyes. Then, he tightly pursed up his lips and said, "Pretty boy, I will trample you to death if you make such irresponsible remarks next time." His voice sounded husky. Everyone was startled because of what had happened just now. It seemed as if a wild demon had crawled out of hell. Gu Tian's face flushed with embarrassment. He forcibly suppressed the injuries to his body and stood up. His vision had turned gloomy and cold. He had never come across such a difficult situation. He had always been considered a Heaven's Pride expert. He had been treated as a treasure worth protecting. He had never been kicked by someone so pathetically. Crunch! Crunch! Gu Tian's broken hands suddenly recovered under his treatment. However, his complexion had turned ashen. He had realized that this man before his eyes wasn't an easy person to deal with. He looked lame. However, he was an exceptionally ominous person. Yi Shiwen had finally understood what Ding Tong had meant by violent temperament after Gu Tian had called Gong Yanjia an ugly freak. All individuals in this team were handsome men and beautiful women. Yi Shiwen wasn't exceptionally handsome. However, he was far from ugly. Only Gong Yanjia and those two old men behind him could be considered ugly. However, Gong Yanjia's reaction was far too violent. Apparently, he cared very much about his physical defect. In layman's language, the more a person cares about something, the less they have of it. The more a person cares about his appearance, the uglier they look. So, one must keep on experimenting with their looks. Also, a person tends to spend less of their money if they care too much about it. Yi Shiwen, each of these people are cruel and rebellious. Each of them is more arrogant and despotic than the other. They are a group of scoundrels. All of them have evil intentions. Are you sure you want to collaborate with these people? Yi Mo's voice reverberated in Yi Ziwen's mind. Yi Shiwen smiled and replied, I wouldn't mind working with a group of devils as long as they provided me enough assistance. Anyhow, these people are only a little cruel and untamed. That's all. Who doesn't want to look domineering nowadays? Xiao Yuan was also looking at Gong Yanjia with an ugly expression on her face. The graceful expression had vanished from her face. She was the one who had found Gu Tian. So, she had obviously lost her reputation. She might appear as a frivolous woman with no real depth in her character. However, she obviously had self-respect and pride since she was an expert of the sage great perfection realm. Fufufu. I told you this pretty boy is useless. However, you can still throw yourself into this old man's arms. I assure you that I will take you to the seventh heaven. The white-robed old man laughed and said. There was a sinister expression on his face. Xiao Yuan's complexion turned ugly. However, she ignored the two wretched old men. Next, I want to make a declaration. Gong Yanjia swept his ice-cold vision across everyone, and said in his usual husky voice, I shall be leading this group. All of you must listen and obey my commands. Who approves? Who opposes? Everyone was taken aback. They obviously hadn't expected this. The original members of the team like Yu Rui and Ding Tong were also shocked. Chapter 551. Who approves and who opposes? Everyone was taken aback. They hadn't thought that Gong Yanjia would declare his intention to lead them. Everyone was left dumbstruck. Is he insane? He is indeed very strong. However, other people in the team are also the experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm. But he wants to control everyone. Is he insane or what? You're insane, you cripple. Nobody had said anything until now. Gu Tian was the first one to respond. He and Gong Yanjia had already become enemies. So, he didn't need to be afraid of anything now. Gong Yanjia stared at Gu Tian with his knife-like vision. His eyes conveyed a simple message. You don't approve? Then, get ready for a brutal fight. Our team contains people from various places. And everyone's strength is nearly the same. There is a saying a bird without wings cannot fly, and a snake without head cannot crawl. Anyway, one of us must step up and lead us in a certain direction. Otherwise, there will be a clash of opinions if there's no leader. Yu Rui opened his mouth this time and said. He hadn't anticipated that Gong Yanjia would say such a thing at this time. However, he and Gong Yanjia had a certain amount of mutual understanding between them. Therefore, he was in favor of Gong Yanjia's proposal. But the complexions of Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan didn't look good. They were already in the weak position among the four original members. Now, Gong Yanjia and Yu Rui had joined hands. So, it wasn't surprising that Yu Rui and Gong Yanjia had gone out together and returned together as well. Unfortunately, the two girls had very bad relations with each other. So, It was impossible for them to join hands to veto out the decision of the two male members of the team. Brother Yi, do you now understand why I had told you that we must stick together? Yi Shiwen heard Ding Tong's voice at this time. Yi Shiwen nodded. They might get swallowed if they didn't stick close together under this situation. Nobody has opposed. So, I'll regard it as everyone's approval. Gong Yanjia swept his dark and cold gaze across everyone. Everyone felt as if a wild beast was staring at them. Yi Shiwen could be called a humanoid monster because of his off-the-charts fighting strength. However, Gong Yanjia had made everyone feel that he was a beast draped in a man's skin. His sinister and ice-cold look had given everyone the chills. Then, everyone came to know from Yu Rui's introduction that these two old men whom Gong Yanjia had brought were known as Yin and Yang brothers. It was said that they were very infamous in a certain star field. It wasn't known how many women they had harmed. They used to plunder women's primary essences for their cultivation. So, it could be said that they were two very cruel people. They used to look for female experts for their cultivation. Many young female experts in that star field had fallen into the evil schemes of these two old bastards. The primary essences of men were useless to them. Therefore, they used to plunder only female experts. It wasn't known how many people had raised their voices against them and had gotten killed for it. They had once alarmed a senior great sage expert. However, they had gotten informed about him in advance and had escaped. The name of other black-clothed ice-cold woman was Mo Zhen. She was a core disciple of a women-only sect. She was outstanding. Fufu, boy, you are only at the late stage of Sage Realm. But, you've still dared to join this group. You're very courageous. However, you'll become a burden on us when the time comes. The black-robed old Yin among the Yin and Yang brothers laughed sinisterly at Yi Shiwen after their introductions had been made. Everyone was at the same level, apart from Yi Shiwen whom Ding Tong had brought. Therefore, everyone was suspecting whether Yi Shiwen had the capability to be one of them. An expert of the late stage of Sage Realm couldn't be considered as weak. But, the said expert couldn't be compared with these experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm. Therefore, saying that he would drag them down wasn't wrong. In fact, it was very logical. I will test him right away, okay? I will kill him right now if he has insufficient strength. The white-robed old Yang spoke loudly and looked into Yi Zaiwen's eyes. His gaze became increasingly ice-cold and ruthless. The white-robed old Yang's voice hadn't even faded when a majestic aura suddenly locked on Yi Shiwen. Then, a big hand suddenly swept down towards Yi Shiwen to grab him. It transformed into a sky full of clouds and slammed down. This was his famous master technique, the Yin and Yang Big Hand Seal. A killer hand came down, and it seemed that it wouldn't give Yi Shiwen any way out. He and Yi Shiwen had no enmity. Still, he had resorted to such an extreme method against him. It was clear that his weird temperament wasn't just for show. Suddenly, a white Yin and Yang fish opened its big mouth and swam towards Yi Shiwen to bite him. Then, the white Yin and Yang fish transformed into a fierce beast. Spirit energies gathered from all directions and integrated into its body. The white-robed old Yang had the experience of several hundred years. So, he had practiced this Yin and Yang Big Hand Seal to an unfathomable extent. It seemed that it would break the entire world as it smashed down. You're overreaching yourself. Yi Shiwen sneered. His entire golden vitality surged out and began to boil. It soared into the sky, and a fist punched upwards. The fist transformed into a big star and dashed up. The Yin and Yang fish had transformed into the yin-yang symbol. It seemed like the most intense collision in the universe when the yin-yang symbol issued an incomparably dreadful explosion. The entire space and the yin-yang symbol had gotten annihilated in that explosion. However, the momentum of Yi Zaiwen's fist hadn't decreased after it had pounded upon that white Yin and Yang fish. Bang! The explosion rose high up in the sky, transformed into endless spirit energies, and scattered in the atmosphere. Yi Shiwen trod forward at an extraordinary pace. His fist had arrived in front of the white-robed old Yang. This is bad, the white-robed old Yang secretly muttered. However, there was no time to regret. So he quickly retreated in frenzy. Rumble! Yi Zaiwen's fist smashed down on the valley, and the entire valley disintegrated. The rest of the people promptly retreated far away from the range of impact. They had a conflicted look on their faces as they looked at Yi Shiwen. Nobody had thought that Yi Shiwen could be so ferocious. Ding Tong was the one who had found him. However, even she hadn't thought that he could be so incredible. After all, she had only seen him escaping from the hands of a great sage expert and nothing more. She had roped him in because she was looking for a person with excellent agility skill. She had thought that it would be rather convenient if someone were to aid her in quick exploration when the time was right. However, she had suddenly seen that Yi Shiwen didn't merely possess an excellent agility skill. In fact, his strength was also very impressive. Everyone had a newfound respect for him. An ordinary person could never possess such awesome strength. And they certainly couldn't issue such a powerful move. She had never thought that Yi Shiwen could have such strength. The white-robed old Yang had retreated. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't going to let him off. That old man had attacked with all of his strength. He hadn't held back even a bit. So, how could Yi Shiwen spare him? Yin and Yang body protection, endless chaos, eternal existence. White-robed old Yang's Yin and Yang fish suddenly transformed into a Yin and Yang symbol and wrapped him up. The black-robed old Yin proudly looked at everyone and said, "This is the super technique of us brothers who follow the path of Yin and Yang. It is known as primal chaos of Yin and Yang. All living things will transform into the energy of Yin and Yang along with any form of energy that breaks into the field. And then it will be absorbed. So, it's impossible to budge us." Everyone felt dreaded when they heard this. They pondered on this matter. How would we break out if we encountered this kind of Yin and Yang field? Everyone frowned since they didn't have any means to escape the field. In fact, it was very difficult to deal with the worldly forces related to chaos, such as Yin and Yang, the 5 elements, and so on. The reason for this was that such forces often flowed in the form of an unending stream. What's so great about this Yin and Yang of yours? Watch how I destroy it. Yi Shiwen was unfazed. His offensive didn't halt even a bit. There was nothing fancy about his attack. In fact, he hadn't used any special move. He had simply unleashed a dreadful attack with sheer brute power. This was the crudest attack. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's big star collided with that Yin and Yang-based attack, and it almost began to transform into Yin and Yang energy. In fact, it seemed as if it was evolving toward a more advanced grade of power. Bang! But then, that Yin and Yang-based attack began to explode in the face of Yi Zaiwen's fierce offensive and set off a dreadful storm. How is this possible? Nobody can tackle my Yin and Yang technique. How did you do it? The white-robed old Yang had a look of disbelief in his eyes as he gazed at Yi Shiwen. He couldn't believe that Yi Shiwen possessed such ability. His Yin and Yang power had emerged out of the dual cultivation. Many people looked down on it. However, it was a very clever kind of martial arts. Yin and Yang together contain the principles of all living things. He could possibly become a great sage expert if he continued to practice the Yin-Yang method. He had fought with many people who were at the same realm as him. However, nobody had been successful at cracking it, let alone cracking it so easily. What Yin and Yang technique? Is your Yin and Yang evenly balanced? Yi Shiwen said disdainfully. It would have been an enormous trouble for him if he had been facing the Yin and Yang brothers together. However, the white-robed old Yang had been relying only on the principle of transforming Yang into Yin. He had transformed a part of his Yang power into Yin polarity. However, the powers of Yin and Yang poles weren't in equilibrium. The power of Yang pole was still more powerful. It was simply impossible to form the balance between Yin and Yang with this creation method. Basically, it only appeared powerful. The white-robed old Yang hadn't met a unique and exceptionally powerful expert like Yi Shiwen before. Yi Zaiwen's offensive effortlessly broke the white-robed old Yang's attack. So, he had started to think about retreating since he was on the verge of death. However, Yi Zaiwen's power locked him firmly on the spot. So, he couldn't go anywhere. Stop! The black-robed old Yin finally reacted. After all, he couldn't let Yi Shiwen proceed with his attack. Suddenly, an extremely pure power of Yin polarity swept out towards Yi Shiwen. It seemed that it would stop him. However, how could it be so easy to stop Yi Shiwen? Bang! Yi Zaiwen's fist power hadn't lost its momentum. So, it finally smashed on the white-robed old Yang's body. Bang! The white-robed old Yang's body disintegrated before everyone's eyes. "Brother!" the black-robed old Yin screamed loudly. Chapter 552. "Brother!" Tears of blood came out of the eyes of the black-robed old Yin as he screamed. These two brothers had been roaming unhindered for many years. They had been inseparable. So, he had never expected that he would have to helplessly watch his brother explode to death one day. And this feeling had simply torn his heart apart. Yi Shiwen stretched out his left hand. It then turned into a claw. And that claw conveniently grabbed the mighty power of the Yin polarity that had been falling down and crushed it. It didn't matter whether it was the power of extreme Yin polarity or extreme Yang polarity. Yi Shiwen would give it no importance if there wasn't a proper balance between the Yin and Yang forces. My God, how can he be so powerful? Xiao Yuan stared blankly at Yi Shiwen. Her eyes contained a terrified expression. She had never thought that Yi Shiwen could be so powerful. She and Ding Tong were sworn enemies. Therefore, she had made fun of Yi Shiwen whom Ding Tong had brought along. However, she hadn't thought that he could be so powerful. And she was extremely shocked as a result. She hadn't been this surprised when that cripple Gong Yanjia had attacked. He had certainly gained the upper hand while confronting Gu Tian. However, both of them belonged to the same realm. And it was normal to have a strong person and a weak person in the same realm. However, Yi Shiwen had killed that white-robed old Yang even though Yi Shiwen was merely at the late stage of Sage Realm. In fact, he had dominated him thoroughly. And that white-robed old Yang didn't even have the power to fight back in the end. These Yin and Yang brothers had to unite in order to display their supreme might. However, it was impossible now. Yu Rui and the other people had also become afraid after they had found out how powerful Yi Shiwen was. It could be clearly seen that they had been blown away by Yi Zaiwen's incredible fighting strength. He had pushed them in a bigger shock as compared to Gong Yanjia. "I'll kill you." The black-robed old Yin stared at Yi Shiwen with bloodshot eyes. It seemed that he wanted to tear him into two halves. A predominantly black Yin and Yang fish boiled in his hand. It then rushed towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen sneered. He was about to deal with this black-robed old Yin when a divine beam fell from the sky and enveloped that black Yin and Yang fish. Everyone stared blankly. The man who had shot that beam turned out to be the cripple Gong Yanjia. His eyes looked dark and ice-cold as he said in his husky voice, "This matter ends here. The entire team must follow my commands from now on. Didn't I tell you not to violate my order?" Gong Yanjia looked into Yi Zaiwen's eyes. His gaze was brimming with anger. However, it contained a bit of jealousy as well. He hadn't attacked Yi Shiwen recklessly since he had also become somewhat afraid of him. He had been taken aback by Yi Zaiwen's recent performance. In fact, he was no longer sure that he would be able to defeat Yi Shiwen. Therefore, he hadn't attacked. He had connived with the white-robed old Yang to launch a big attack on Yi Shiwen. He had planned to take him down using the old Yang's brute strength. After all, he knew that everyone in this team had ulterior motives. So, he had planned to attack Yi Shiwen in order to overwhelm the others. However, he had clearly understood that he had made a blunder. There were many things that weren't as smooth as he imagined them to be. The white-robed old Yang had died at the hands of Yi Shiwen. But he couldn't let the black-robed old Yin die in a similar fashion. After all, he would lose his prestige if that happened. "He has killed my brother." The eyes of the black-robed old Yin were wide open. He hadn't thought that he would lose his brother in this fight. His heart was full of hatred for Yi Shiwen. However, he couldn't understand that the problem lay with him and his brother. After all, they wouldn't have kicked an iron wall like Yi Shiwen if they hadn't been so arrogant and despotic. In fact, this represented the saying "you reap what you sow." Awesome. Gee, I couldn't have imagined that a character like you would be hidden among us. You're an elusive talent. The universe is so big, and it's full of wonderful things. Yu Rui stepped forward to resolve the dispute. A man like Brother Yi is involved in our operation this time. So, our operation will certainly go smoothly. No harm will come our way. Yu Rui continued. The black-robed old Yin didn't behave arrogantly towards Yi Shiwen this time. This represented the so-called saying one shows their arrogance towards those who aren't as powerful as them. After all, one must maintain their so-called dignity. The black-robed old Yin couldn't be arrogant while dealing with an expert like Yi Shiwen. Otherwise, it would be too bad for him if Yi Shiwen misunderstood him and got provoked. Moreover, he had also witnessed Yi Zaiwen's ruthless side by now. So, he didn't wish to confront Yi Shiwen directly. The black-robed old Yin swept his gaze across everyone. Ding Tong would definitely stand on Yi Zaiwen's side. Xiao Yuan had also become furious with him and his brother a moment ago. Gu Tian had been blown away by his boss Gong Yanjia. So, he wouldn't help him either. Gong Yanjia could be considered to be on his side, but he didn't seem to be interested in collaborating against Yi Shiwen. He could guess what these people were thinking at the moment. Each of them was selfish and had personal ambitions. So, why would they agree to take the risk of testing out Yi Zaiwen's true strength in order to avenge his brother? Moreover, who would cry for them if they got slaughtered by Yi Shiwen? He knew that he was no match for Yi Shiwen without their help. His strength was almost the same as that of his brothers. And Yi Shiwen had made his brother retreat again and again. His brother had been comprehensively defeated. In fact, his brother had been killed in only one move. The black-robed old Yin wasn't much better than his brother. The two brothers could have contended against Yi Shiwen if they had joined hands against him. But how could they possibly join hands now? Therefore, he could only clench his teeth and glare at Yi Shiwen. He had to forcibly make himself give up the idea of attacking Yi Shiwen. However, he had developed a deep hatred for Yi Shiwen in his heart. He would certainly not think twice before attacking Yi Shiwen if he got the right opportunity. He hated all these people as well. After all, his brother would still be alive if they had tried to save him instead of sitting back and watching him die. Yi Shiwen coldly looked at everyone. He had understood that each person in this team had ulterior motives. In fact, it was difficult to understand how such a team had been formed in the first place. He could trust Ding Tong, and only slightly at that. However, he believed that the other people would turn against him as soon as they got the opportunity. In fact, they wouldn't even think twice about it. All of us want to go to the tomb because there might be some secret regarding advancing to the great sage realm at that place. However, there's no need to harm friends. Yu Rui pretended to be a good man and said, it would be difficult to figure what kind of person was behind his goody two-shoes persona if one hadn't seen the arrogance on his face earlier. We shouldn't delay in that case. It would be better if we got there quickly. Yi Shiwen said, what are you so desperate about? The tomb wouldn't have opened yet. Gong Yanjia's hoarse voice revealed a contemptuous tone. It was clear that he was making fun of Yi Zaiwen's lack of knowledge. However, Yi Shiwen didn't get angry. After all, he indeed didn't know anything about this matter. So, it would be better if he followed other people for now. There must be layer upon layer of matrix formations outside the tomb. A large number of experts must have arrived there already. They may have brought the masters of matrix formations along with them. We don't need to attack the matrix formations. We must wait until those experts and masters have broken them down. We will take advantage of the confusion once those matrix formations are down, and we will enter without making any delay. Gong Yanjia said, a large number of experts must have arrived this time, and many of them should be at the sage accomplished level. They could get mixed among the ordinary experts and launch a surprise attack. Therefore, we must stay united. You must obey my orders. Otherwise, we will be defeated when the time comes. So, don't blame me for being strict. Gong Yanjia was looking at Yi Shiwen as he said. Clearly, what he had said was directed at Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Shiwen was the only one among these people whose ambitions he couldn't see through. Moreover, he had become a bit scared after he had witnessed Yi Zaiwen's power. He was confident that he could deal with most of these people. But there was one person who might not obey him. And that individual was this extremely powerful, untamed, domineering, and violent man Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen showed neither approval nor disapproval. He remained quiet. After all, he would look for an opportunity to get away from this group when the time would come. And stay united? It was all bullshit. Anyone could tell that these people could never unite. Gong Yanjia had urged them to stay united in order to stop them from turning against each other. And this was probably a good strategy for now. Yi Shiwen wouldn't think of destroying this unity under normal conditions. However, Gong Yanjia had better not blame Yi Shiwen for being strict if the former tried to treat him as cannon fodder. Roar! 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 Gong Yanjia hadn't finished criticizing Yi Shiwen when the roars of demon beasts reverberated in the surroundings. Black clouds filled the entire sky, and waves of evil wind appeared like wailing ghosts and howling wolves. Countless tyrannical figures of hill-sized demon beasts appeared in front of everyone. Everyone's complexion suddenly changed. They were surrounded by an army of demon beasts. One must know that the most dangerous entities in the Great Gas Collar were these demon beasts. Nobody had been able to wipe out these demon beasts in all these years. The formidable ones among them had even formed a country of demon beasts. There wasn't any difference between them and the humans, apart from their appearance. The most ferocious ones among them were the so-called commander beasts and soldier beasts. An ordinary person would have a hard time escaping if they came across them. These demon beasts were very cunning. In fact, the old demon beasts that had been living for thousands of years were as intelligent as humans, if not more. They had gathered as an army in order to chase and kill these human experts who had entered the Great Gas Collar. These demon beasts were much more organized as compared to the unorganized experts in Yi Zaiwen's team and all the other experts who had arrived from the River Shore Star Field and many other star fields. And this organized army of demon beasts was a deadly threat. An ordinary person would have to struggle in order to escape if they came across these demon beasts. Damn it! How have these demon beasts found us? Yu Rui couldn't maintain his elegant demeanor this time and secretly cursed. Yi Shiwen, Gu Tian, Xiao Yuan, and Ding Tong immediately recalled that demon beast who had been spying on them. They had killed it. However, they didn't know that it had managed to send the information which had attracted such a big army of demon beasts. Chapter 553. Countless tyrannical demon beasts had been lurking in the Great Gas Collar. And it would be the most dreadful thing when they'd assembled and form an army. Yi Shiwen looked at the battle formation of the demon beasts. The majority of these demon beasts were at the semi-sage realm. Some more powerful and adult ones were at the sage realm. Such an army was terrifying from a general perspective. Hardly anyone could deal with this army. Humans, you must surrender obediently and become my slaves. I may spare your life if you do so. A buzzing voice came from the army of the demon beasts. It sounded somewhat hoarse and shaky. It seemingly sounded a bit shaky because they weren't used to talking in the human tongue. This army is being led by a demon commander. Yu Rui frowned and said. However, he looked somewhat relaxed. After all, it was much better to have a demon commander leading the army than a demon king. It didn't matter how powerful a demon commander was. It could at most be at the sage great perfection level. However, a demon king in the Great Gas Collar could even be at the sage accomplished realm. They might get an opportunity to escape if they were to come across such a large army of demon beasts or a sage accomplished level demon king. However, they wouldn't stand a chance if they had to face both of them together. However, Yi Shiwen could escape from the hands of a great sage expert. So, he wasn't much concerned. In fact, everyone had become relaxed after they had realized that it was only a demon commander who was leading this army. The demons have arrived. Everyone must get ready to execute them. Gong Yanjia sneered. What kind of arrogance did he possess? He wanted to command these experts in order to attain the supreme throne in the team. So, how could he surrender to these demon beasts? It was impossible. His voice hadn't faded when his legs suddenly stepped out. It transformed into boundless wind and clouds, and stamped down. Bang! A large number of demon beasts got crushed to death. The space got trampled down by his leg. Gong Yanjia's tyrannical power was simply incredible. his cripple-looking leg was his weak point. But it was also his biggest weapon. He had transformed his defective leg into a sage tool. So, it possessed endless might and was extremely terrifying. It was no wonder that Gu Tian hadn't been able to stop his kick and had been sent flying. Undoubtedly, one of the reasons for it was that there was a difference in their strengths. However, the main reason was the infinite might that his leg had obtained after being transformed into a sage tool. The troubles keep coming one after another. Yi Shiwen frowned. It could be said that there were endless troubles in the Great Gas Collar. However, he didn't have any other option at this time. He had to go all out and slaughter these demon beasts. In fact, it wasn't only Gong Yanjia. Even the others weren't ready to withdraw. They all attacked one after another. They were outstanding people. They wouldn't surrender to anyone, let alone to these demon beasts. These sage great perfection level experts had attacked with their entire strength. How could those semi-sage level demon beasts stop their attacks? Even the sage level demon beasts in that group screamed as they got crushed to death one after another. Damn it, humans, you don't listen until you've been forced. Kill them for me, my children. Their flesh and blood will be a treat for us. The demon commanders flustered, and an exasperated command came from the middle of the army of the demon beasts. It believed that it was giving these humans a chance to live. Therefore, it hadn't expected that these humans would dare injure his children by disregarding his mercy. Suddenly, the densely packed army of demon beasts rushed towards the human team in an overwhelming manner. And a myriad of demonic martial arts were unleashed towards the human experts to kill them. These demon beasts couldn't match with these outstanding experts individually. However, they were marching in formation at this time. So, they were able to firmly resist the attacks of these outstanding experts. Yu Rui and the other people could only unceasingly evade while facing this joint attack that consisted of various demonic martial arts. They didn't dare to get close. However, Yi Shiwen didn't have time to care about other people. Countless densely packed demon beasts were rushing towards him. A storm of demon beasts was rushing towards him along with waves of demon wind. Countless martial arts transformed into demonic beams and swept out towards him. Yi Shiwen didn't dare to delay. He promptly started to operate the observing person scripture inside his body. Then, two hammer-like fists transformed into two big stars and smashed down. Bang! 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 Pitiful screams were heard every time Yi Zaiwen's hammer-like fists pounded. They were accompanied by explosions of flesh and blood. Yi Mo was busy enjoying himself inside Yi Zaiwen's body. After all, the blood essences and inner cores of these demon beasts were being absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. Consequently, the mirror was becoming more and more powerful with each passing second. Its aura was also becoming more and more pure and smooth. Apparently, it was advancing towards an amazing transformation. It had to move ahead one step in order to transform into a great sage tool from a sage tool. It would be able to crush these demon beasts effortlessly once it had completed the transformation. The difference between a sage tool and great sage tool was same as the difference between a sage expert and great sage expert. It was like the difference between cloud and mud, or heaven and earth. A great sage tool's full strength attack was almost equal to a great sage expert's full strength attack. It wouldn't matter how tyrannical the army of these sage-level demon beasts was if they were attacked with a great sage tool. They would be obliterated without exception. However, a huge amount of energy was required in order to complete the transformation. And it would take a lot of time to gather that much energy. Yi Shiwen was fighting with his entire strength since those demon beasts were way too many. He wasn't worried about defending himself or exhausting his entire real elemental energy. However, other people were. Ding Tong was fighting with a sage-level demon beast. It was a terrifying expert of the sage great perfection realm. She was unceasingly swallowing spirit dawn for replenishing her real elemental energy. However, she still wasn't able to keep up with the energy consumption required for facing the full strength attacks of this sage great perfection level expert. The attack of a sage great perfection level expert would certainly be overwhelming. Therefore, the consumption of real elemental energy and spirit energies would be of an astronomical amount. How could she meet this requirement by depending upon her own natural rate of restoration? It was impossible unless she possessed a secret magical technique like the Phoenix regeneration technique that went against the heaven's will. Ding Tong was attacking with her entire strength and was swallowing all sorts of spirit dawn for replenishing her real elemental energy. However, she was still finding it difficult to hold her own. It was difficult to say who was stronger and who was weaker between a human expert and a demon beast, since both of them had strong and weak points. The key was to see who could display their strengths to the peak at a crucial time. Only the one who could display their strength to the peak could defeat their enemy. Ding Tong had ample fighting experience. However, her opponent was more cunning than her. And it was taking proper advantage of its tyrannical body. In fact, she would have lost 100 times by now if Yi Shiwen hadn't been helping her from time to time. Yi Shiwen, the blood essences of these semi-sage and sage-level demon beasts aren't enough. You must supply the Heavenly Source Mirror with lots of good quality blood essences if you want the Heavenly Source Mirror to become a great sage tool. In fact, it should level up very quickly if you kill a few great sage-level beasts and let it absorb their whole blood essences. Yi Mo's voice reverberated in Yi Zaiwen's mind. He had absorbed a lot of blood essence and inner cores by now. However, those couldn't be put to use immediately. After all, he had to refine them first. Therefore, one must not look at it as the quantity is very huge, because high quantity is directly related to low quality. Therefore, the final result wouldn't be that good. It would be far better to kill a powerful demon beast to get the desired result. Other people would have certainly gotten scared to death if they had heard Yi Mo's idea. Gong Yanjia had killed many demon beasts under his foot. In fact, he had even crushed a demon commander of sage great perfection level. However, even he wouldn't dare to go deeper into the formation of these beasts. One would be torn to pieces by the countless formidable demon beasts if they went deeper into their formation. However, this was nothing for Yi Shiwen. It was very difficult for those demon beasts to injure him. Moreover, he could insteel himself with the help of Phoenix regeneration technique even if he sustained injuries. Therefore, this wasn't a problem for him. Yi Shiwen silently thought for a moment. What? You're asking me to kill a few great sage demon beasts? Great sage demon beasts don't grow on trees. It is very difficult to find them. Moreover, I can only escape a great sage demon beast. I'm not powerful enough to kill one. So, chasing after a great sage demon beast is definitely not a thing to consider. Promotion of Heavenly Source Mirror to Great Sage level still looked far-fetched. He had already decided that he would make Heavenly Source Mirror his primary divine tool. Therefore, it was worth it to invest everything into the Heavenly Source Mirror. After all, he would obtain great benefits in the future in the form of repayment. However, Yi Shiwen still decided to try to burst into the formation of demon beasts. There are too many demon beasts. They seem to be infinite in number. But this problem can't be solved by simply wasting time. In fact, the demon beasts would continue to arrive if we delay. Moreover, it won't be easy to wipe them out if they went back to the kingdom of demon beasts. The best way would be to kill the commanding general of these demon beasts. Then this army of demon beasts would scatter. These demon beasts can be considered as intelligent as the human beings. However, they aren't humans. All of them are cruel and rebellious. They have gathered only because of the deterrence of their great general. So, I reckon that they will disperse if that senior demon general of theirs is killed. Yi Shiwen didn't hesitate any further after he had thought this. He transformed into a golden streamer and burst into the group of demon beasts. Everyone watched him blankly as he burst into the group of demon beasts. Does he have a death wish? There's no need to be so rash. Yu Rui muttered to himself as his bayonet pierced an approaching demon beast. The other experts couldn't believe that someone had dared to burst into the demon beasts. One could probably sweep away a tribe of ordinary demon beasts. However, such an organized army of demon beasts was extremely terrifying. Damn it! This boy better not die. The black-robed old Een said as if he was showing pity. However, he wasn't feeling pity for Yi Shiwen. He had said these words only because he wanted to kill him personally. What's he up to? An expression of shock flashed in Ding Tong's eyes. She didn't know what Yi Shiwen was planning to do. Gong Yanjia had been indulged in a crazy slaughter. However, even he was in a state of disbelief at the moment. But he didn't believe that Yi Shiwen was some crazy guy. He's a guy who kills very decisively. How can such a guy be insane? So, the only possibility is that he has some assurance. What's he leaning on? Why is he so powerful? Chapter 554. Yi Shiwen didn't care about what other people were thinking at this time. His entire focus was on capturing the leader of these demon beasts. He wanted to kill that demon general as soon as possible. Otherwise, many junior demon beasts could get attracted towards this place, like moths are attracted towards light. One of the biggest reasons for the death of the majority of experts every time the Great Gas Collar had opened was that they had come across the army of demon beasts. The royal clan of the Great Yu State used to send its organized army to suppress the experts of the devil race whenever they surfaced around the Great Yu State in large numbers. The current scenario was basically the same as that. It was just that the positions had changed this time. Children, someone is daring to penetrate our battle formation. Show him our ferocity. A malicious laugh reverberated among the demon beasts. Yi Zaiwen's act was equivalent to courting death in their opinion. An expert of the Sage Great Perfection realm might be able to kill hundreds of semi-sage experts with just a slap. However, 1,000 or 10,000 semi-sage experts could contend against that expert of Sage Great Perfection realm if they joined hands. In fact, they could even kill the said expert of Sage Great Perfection realm. Whether it is quality or quantity, whichever side would display their strength to the extreme would emerge victorious. Yi Shiwen found that there were many different kinds of demon beasts when he went deeper inside. And all kinds of demon beasts were in abundance. There were many strange kinds of demon beasts present among them as well. So, he became certain that there was at least one kingdom of demon beasts nearby. An ordinary pack of demon beasts often possessed only one kind of demon beasts. It wasn't normal to have many different kinds of demon beasts mixed together. These demon beasts were arranged in squadrons of 3 or 4. These squadrons of 3 or 4 had combined to form a big battle formation. These demon beasts had already attained spiritual wisdom. And that was the most terrifying thing. Fufufu, there's a human expert. Such exuberant vitality. My martial power will reach to an unfathomable extent after consuming him. I haven't seen a human expert in a long time. Ha! He's bringing us blood and food. These human experts are the overlords and princes of their respective star fields. They are the elites. Each of them possesses infinite wealth. We would become rich if we looted even one of them. These demon beasts revealed greedy looks when they saw Yi Shiwen coming in. A human expert would need special methods if they wanted to absorb the blood essence of a demon beast and transform it into their martial power. However, these demon beasts possessed innate instincts. They could obtain the desired energy from the various types of flesh and blood that they consumed. Consuming a person like Yi Shiwen could be greatly beneficial to them. After all, Yi Shiwen had cultivated a formidable body-type power technique. His body contained plentiful blood, and he possessed vitality to an unfathomable extent. Moreover, he was hardly concealing his vitality right now. In fact, he had set it free. Therefore, his vitality had started to dazzle like a beacon in the night sky. Moreover, human experts often carried a lot of wealth on them. This was also the goal that they coveted. The demon beasts arranged themselves into a huge formation and madly attacked Yi Shiwen. They had attacked from every direction in an overwhelming manner. The scene looked exceptionally shocking. Buried person sword. Yi Zaiwen's ice-cold voice seemed to have transmitted from hell. It sounded ruthless and callous. Whoosh! 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 Thousands of sword lights appeared in the sky and rushed out for hundreds of miles. The sword lights then slashed toward those soldiers who were rushing in. Bang! 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 It didn't matter whether it was a semi-sage expert or a sage expert. They all got cut into two halves by Yi Zaiwen's sword lights, and subsequently transformed into masses of blood fog. They were being slaughtered miserably, and the masses of blood fog that were being produced as a result were being absorbed by the heavenly source mirror inside Yi Zaiwen's body. There was no difference between semi-sage experts or sage experts before Yi Zaiwen's sword lights. All of them were getting slaughtered. Yi Shiwen was on a rampage. He seemed like a precise slaughtering machine. He was running amok and was slaughtering all these demon beasts. Yi Shiwen seemed like a heavy tank without brakes. He was simply unstoppable at the moment. The sword lights soared wherever he went. Each of his ice-cold and ruthless sword strikes appeared as accurate as mentioned in the textbook. Even the most basic sword techniques projected incredible power in his hands. Even the most random combinations of basic sword techniques possessed the might of some stunning sword technique. Yi Shiwen had gradually found some rhythm in transitioning between the lifting heavy weight as if light realm and lifting light weight as if heavy realm as he practiced it on the bodies of those demon beasts. Therefore, even a light sword strike could crush them like a heavy mountain. The demon beasts that had managed to enroll in this army were considered as the well-known figures among the demon beasts. However, they still couldn't contend against Yi Shiwen since he possessed the fighting prowess of a Heaven's Pride expert. They were simply not on his level. These demon beasts contained powerful energy of blood essence inside their bodies. So, the heavenly source mirror emitted increasingly bright rays of light since it was getting to absorb this blood essence. In fact, most of the attacks of these demon beasts weren't even reaching near Yi Zaiwen's body. They were exploding beforehand. They were being blocked by the scarlet screen of light that had been emitted by the heavenly source mirror. Even Yi Mo didn't wish to be left out. He rushed out of Yi Zaiwen's body, and a series of scarlet lights also swept out along with him. The demon beasts that got swept away by these blood lights immediately screamed, transformed into a pool of blood, and got absorbed in their entirety. Yi Zaiwen's slaughtering speed increased dramatically with Yi Mo's participation, and he slowly moved towards the core of the army of demon beasts. The depths of the army formation of these demon beasts felt overwhelming. The demon beasts were present everywhere. However, Yi Shiwen could still see that there was a city inside. In fact, it was a magical weapon in the shape of a city. The commanding general of this army of demon beasts was present in the center of this city. It appeared domineering and magnificent. Yi Shiwen was consuming his real elemental energy at a fast pace under such slaughtering. The primary spirit dawn were burning unceasingly inside the heavenly source mirror in order to replenish his real elemental energy. Yi Shiwen had to resort to this method in order to replenish his energy because of the non-stop slaughtering. No one could have dared to burst in like it. Otherwise, they would certainly have been annihilated. "Human, accept your fate." A deep, gruff, and angry voice came from afar. It sounded like a thunderclap. Then, a hill-sized demon beast dashed towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. This demon beast's body was completely covered in hard armor. Its grandiose aura locked upon Yi Shiwen. Its boundless aura swept out like a wave and swept away everything. Even the demon beasts in the vicinity had been swept away. However, this demon beast didn't seem to care. Instead, it appeared to be brimming with ruthlessness and thirst for blood. Its hill-sized body came charging in an overwhelming manner. Its gigantic body arrived in front of Yi Shiwen, but it somehow seemed as if a giant mountain had collapsed in front of someone. However, Yi Zaiwen's complexion looked tranquil. It didn't change even a bit. His brain was immersed in a high degree of calculation. He looked ice-cold and accurate like a machine at this time. He wouldn't make any mistake. His slim body quickly rushed up to face that hill-sized figure. Bang! Two entirely different bodies collided inside the army of demon beasts. One was big and the other was small. Massive and terrifying forces swept out from both bodies and set off endless astral winds. Those astral winds condensed into an energy storm and swept all across. That energy storm rushed out in all directions like layers of dreadful sea waves and devastated everything in its path. Roar! 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 Those demon beasts in the vicinity that had been swept away by the energy storm screamed. After all, all of them had sustained serious injuries. In fact, the ones that had been close to the collision had been crushed into masses of minced meat. It was a scary sight. The clash between two Sage Great Perfection level fighting powers was second only to the clash between two Sage Accomplished level ones. The world collapsed and disintegrated. The calamity caused by this fight inside the army of demon beasts involved many of the surrounding demon beasts. However, Yi Shiwen didn't care. Why would he care about the deaths of these demon beasts? Moreover, this demon beast was obviously accustomed to brutality as well. So, it too didn't care whether its subordinates died or survived. Bang! 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 This was a collision of two unequal bodies in terms of size. However, the one that had gone out flying wasn't the slim human. Instead, it was that hill-sized Sage Great Perfection level demon beast. This was way beyond the expectations of the demon beasts that were witnessing this fight. That hill-sized demon beast had been forced to retreat several steps by Yi Zaiwen's kick. It had gone back several steps. And every step of it had broken the space. Numerous cracks had been opened in the sky as a result. It could be clearly seen what kind of gravitational pressure it carried. Blood was seeping out from under its scale armor. Yi Zaiwen's attack had seriously injured its internal organs even though it had worn armor. A terrified expression appeared in the eyes of the demon beast. It hadn't thought that this ordinary-looking human could be so powerful. Demon beasts were closely dependent upon their build regardless of whether they possessed formidable strength or not. However, Yi Zaiwen's frail body couldn't be considered big even among humans, let alone among these demon beasts. Therefore, Yi Zaiwen's body was like that of an ant as far as these demon beasts were concerned. It seemed as if someone was going to trample an ant to death, but had been injured by the ant instead. However, Yi Shiwen didn't have time to waste. He quickly condensed the Han seal. It then transformed into a giant mountain and slammed down. Bang! The sky turned into a complete mess as numerous cracks got opened in it by the intense pressure of that mountain seal. The Sage Great Perfection level demon beast didn't get enough time to evade, and got suppressed to death along with several hundred other demon beasts in the vicinity. Yi Shiwen gripped his sword and went further inside the army of demon beasts. And he continued his slaughter of demon beasts en route. Everyone was watching Yi Zaiwen's progress from the outside. There were some people who were looking forward to seeing him die in there. However, they were all outstanding talents. So, how could they not have figured that Yi Shiwen wasn't some crazy guy? He certainly had some backup. Yi Zaiwen's march into the deeper parts of this demon beast's army gave rise to loud noises. There was chaos inside the entire army of demon beasts, and it was impossible to sweep in the divine sense to observe clearly. However, it could still be sensed where Yi Shiwen was, and where the chaos in the demon beast legion was. He is truly a monster. These words appeared in everyone's mind. The look of terror in the eyes of Gong Yanjia got more and more intense. Chapter 555. Yu Rui and the other people hoped that Yi Shiwen would succeed in slaughtering the commanding general of the demon beasts as his assault started making more and more noise. Otherwise, they would get surrounded even more tightly by this army of demon beasts. And who would dare to say that they could escape if that happened unless they were an expert of the Sage Accomplished realm? They might have underestimated Yi Shiwen initially. However, nobody dared to look down upon him now. It wasn't considered a big thing if a Sage Great Perfection level expert defeated another Sage Great Perfection level expert. However, it was a shocking thing if an expert of the late stage of Sage Realm defeated an expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm. Perhaps, only a top-notch Heaven's Pride expert could achieve such a feat. In fact, they couldn't say with certainty whether a top-tier Heaven's Pride expert of the late stage of Sage Realm could defeat an ordinary Sage Great Perfection level expert. In contrast, it seemed that Yi Shiwen could even prevail over a top-notch Heaven's Pride expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm. Thus, the disparity was huge. Yi Shiwen didn't know what they were thinking. He didn't have the time to think about that right now. After all, an increasing number of demon beasts were surrounding him from all directions as he penetrated deeper and deeper whilst carrying his assault toward the center. his consumption of real elemental energy had reached to a terrifying height at the moment. Consequently, the heavenly source mirror had given up on absorbing the inner cores of demon beasts, and had begun to transform the demon elemental energy that was present inside these inner cores into real elemental energy in order to keep up with the increasingly high energy consumption. Otherwise, the consumption of primary spirit dawn would have reached to an astronomical figure. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had been encountering the elite demon beasts since he had reached close to the center. These demon beasts were much more ferocious than those on the outskirts. The majority of the demon beasts on the outskirts were at the semi-sage realm. But those demon beasts had been replaced by sage-level demon beasts after Yi Shiwen had reached close to the center. Even Yi Shiwen had begun to find it strenuous. He had finally realized that there was a fundamental difference in the quality of this army of demon beasts and the hordes of demon beasts that he had slaughtered in the past. An average person would have already died if they had been in his place. Yi Shiwen, you can't continue to delay. Otherwise, a mishap may befall you. Yi Mo warned loudly. Yi Mo's entire body had turned red and was exuding an ominous bloody glow. He used to be somewhat weak and transparent. However, his entity had solidified after he had absorbed the inner cores and blood essences of a number of demon beasts during this battle. The heavenly source mirror had obtained enormous benefits. In fact, his body might take form if it continued like this. Yi Mo was merely a tool spirit. However, Yi Shiwen had always seen him as a mentor and a friend. Therefore, he would help him in reconstruction of his body and free him from the shackles of the heavenly source mirror with the passage of time. Of course, it would be better if Yi Mo chose the heavenly source mirror as his core and assimilated it. However, this wouldn't work for Yi Shiwen since Yi Shiwen intended to make the heavenly source mirror his primary divine tool. Therefore, only two ways could be adopted. Either Yi Mo had to obtain an exceptionally good body, or he had to reconstruct his body by absorbing enough blood essence. At this moment, Yi Mo felt that his body would be formed again. Yi Shiwen nodded. I can't go on like this. It's already too late. I must kill all of those sage great perfection level demon beasts. They are the generals of this army. This army of demon beasts would collapse and fall into confusion if I kill those generals. Yi Shiwen didn't wait any longer after he had thought this. He quickly unfolded his devil wings, transformed into a streamer of light, and shuttled inside the army of demon beasts like a lightning bolt. The power of wind and thunder began to boil on his wings, and issued a thunderstorm. Those demon beasts which had been making futile attempts to get close to him were swept away by the power of wind and thunder, and were left to perish in the end. Yi Shiwen had finally gone all out. He had unleashed all of his firepower. A senior sage great perfection level demon beast had occupied a spot in the depth of the army. It was emitting a fierce aura from its body. It shouted at its subordinates, and commanded them to launch a suicidal attack on Yi Shiwen. However, such tactics wouldn't work on a person like Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Shiwen possessed a brilliant understanding of military tactics. In fact, this was simply a beginner's tactic in his eyes. After all, he had read all the books in the library of the Yuan school. He had grasped all the concepts of battle. In fact, he had a better understanding of military tactics than the veterans of his time. However, he hadn't gotten the opportunity to use these tactics till now. Moreover, he even had a profound understanding of those so-called theoretical battle tactics which were hard to put into practice. However, he was still astonished to see that this demon beast general had the ability to unleash his troops to their demise. Yi Zaiwen's speed was extremely quick, and he arrived in front of that demon beast general of sage great perfection realm in an instant. Many soldiers were present in front of that general as a defensive line, but they weren't able to stop Yi Zaiwen's footsteps. Instead, they got blown away by the power of wind and thunder of his devil wings. Puny human, how dare you intrude in my domain? That demon beast general of sage great perfection realm swept its glance. Its eyes looked cruel and ruthless as it swept out its tail towards Yi Shiwen. Its tail was thicker than Yi Zaiwen's body. The pointed end of the tail pierced through the vast sky and produced cracks in it. Its tail was no less than a magic weapon. Bang! Yi Shiwen grasped that thick tail with his hands, and the veins in his arms swelled as a result. He then spun around that sage great perfection level demon beast chief, and formed a huge whirlwind. And the demon beasts that had been trying to get close got swept away in a split second as a result. Another demon beast of sage great perfection realm rushed over. It trod down the sky, and launched a long-range raid. This attack left the entire world to tremble and distorted the sky. Crack! The shrill sound of breaking of space was heard as Yi Shiwen threw away that sage great perfection level demon beast general. And it went into the direction of that other sage great perfection level demon beast that was executing the long-range raid. Bang! The two hill-sized beasts suddenly collided with each other and shook the world. Yi Shiwen strode forward and stepped across a long section of space. He had arrived above the two giant beasts in the sky in an instant. He brandished his fist. It smashed in the space, and a tremendous force suddenly exploded in the void. The two sage great perfection level demon beasts were supposed to be extremely powerful, but they were practically nothing in front of Yi Zaiwen's fist. They got crushed into a mass of blood fog by the big star. Then, the heavenly source mirror absorbed their blood essence. Suddenly, the heavenly source mirror emitted brilliant rays of scarlet light. The blood essence obtained from these two sage great perfection level demon beasts was much better than the blood essence obtained from the entire crowd of semi-sage level demon beasts. However, Yi Shiwen didn't stop there. He went deeper into the formation and continued to slaughter the sage great perfection level demon beasts wherever he saw them. Those sage great perfection level demon beasts were considered to be extremely fierce, but they looked insignificant in front of him. At present, Yi Shiwen could defeat even a Heaven's Pride expert of Sage Great Perfection realm. So, these ordinary Sage Great Perfection level demon beasts were nothing for him. Who is this human? He is brutal. It seems that he's targeting the Sage Great Perfection level demon beasts like us. Damn it. This man is killing wantonly. He wants to kill all of us. The demon beast generals began to use their divine senses to communicate among themselves. After all, they had realized that Yi Shiwen wanted to eliminate all of them in order to cause the collapse of their army of demon beasts. There were numerous demon beasts in this army. In fact, they were simply endless. However, there weren't many demon beasts of Sage Great Perfection realm among them. There were only about a dozen of them, and only 6 of them remained at this time. Yi Shiwen and Gong Yanjia had killed the others. Therefore, those remaining 6 demon beasts of Sage Great Perfection realm rushed out at the same time. After all, they couldn't allow Yi Shiwen to continue with his killing spree. Otherwise, the entire army of demon beasts could collapse. Those 6 demon beasts had rushed out collectively. Each of them was at the Sage Great Perfection realm. So, they could be considered as the elites among sage experts. Damn human, die. Those Sage Great Perfection level demon beasts assembled in a matrix formation. They strode over quickly like a storm even though they had enormous bodies. Then, they launched a joint attack on Yi Shiwen. Those attacks condensed into an incredibly huge sword in the sky and swept down towards Yi Shiwen. These Sage Great Perfection level demon beasts had used a special matrix formation. The combined strength of the 6 huge Sage Great Perfection level beasts had been concentrated into that incredibly huge sword. So, it seemed that it would smash the sky into pieces. Some unlucky demon beasts couldn't escape in time, and were cut into 2 halves by that sword. The huge sword had even smashed their souls into pieces. It was evident that those demon beasts didn't have any luck on their side. Ha! Yi Shiwen shouted as his golden vitality surged out. Buried Heaven Sword. Yi Zaiwen's pores emitted sword energy. This sword energy condensed into a sword in the sky, and faced the bombardment of the incoming sword energy. Rumble! The 2 swords suddenly collided with each other. Nothing could remain intact under the dreadful force issued by this collision. It swept out energies. These energies swirled in the air and crushed the space into fine powder. Consequently, the chaotic energy was left to surge in all directions. However, The potency of the sword intention that was condensed inside Yi Zaiwen's sword energies didn't decrease. Moreover, Yi Zaiwen's sword had already defeated the sword that had been condensed jointly by those sage great perfection level demon beasts. Bang! 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 The sage great perfection level demon beasts weren't able to resist Yi Zaiwen's ferocious buried heaven sword. Then his formidable sword intention locked onto them and left them incapable of making an escape. Therefore they got chopped down and transformed into a mass of blood fog. They had been at the sage great perfection level before their deaths. However, there was a difference of cloud and mud between their strength and that of Yi Zaiwen's. The remaining demon beasts instantly scattered like scared birds as this happened. After all, they had been freed from the reins of these sage great perfection level demon beasts. So they let out strange cries and began to run away one after another. These human experts seemed like gods of death to them. In fact, these demon beasts would have escaped long ago if they hadn't been under the restraints of those few sage great perfection level demon beasts. However, they didn't have those restraints on them anymore since those sage great perfection level demon beasts had been killed by Yi Shiwen. Therefore, these ordinary demon beasts had decided to flee. Chapter 556. Those demon beast soldiers scattered like scared birds and disappeared without a trace. After that, Yi Shiwen collected that huge city at the center of the army of demon beasts. After all, it was a sage tool. It was certainly undeveloped. However, it was a sage tool nonetheless. Ha! Yi Shiwen, it's a big gain. Yi Mo's excited voice emitted from the depths of Yi Zaiwen's mind. It's hard to tell how much wealth this army of demon beasts had plundered, and all that wealth has been concentrated in this city-type divine tool. Yi Zaiwen's divine sense made a round. This army of demon beasts had been moving unhindered in the Great Gas Collar for several hundred years. It was hard to say how many treasures and spirit dawn had been plundered by them. The majority of that wealth had already been consumed by them. However, an astronomical amount of wealth was still left in the stock. There were hundreds of pseudo-sage tools among that wealth. These pseudo-sage tools couldn't be sold for as much as the sage tools in the outside world. However, their quantity was extremely huge. So, they could collectively be sold for a good price. Many elixirs were also present among the treasures. These elixirs had matured to a great extent since the Great Gas Collar had opened after a long time. In fact, they had become exuberant. The demon beasts that had gathered these elixirs didn't have the ability to refine them using alchemy. So, they had basically gathered them for direct consumption. They used to eat all kinds of heavenly treasures. They were exceptionally luxurious. And all these things had fallen into Yi Zaiwen's hands now. However, he didn't pay attention to them and placed them inside the heavenly source mirror. Everyone was blankly staring at his cyan figure in the sky. Their eyes were full of disbelief. He has slaughtered them all within such a short span of time. Ding Tong's face also exposed a look of disbelief as she gazed at Yi Shiwen. She was the one who had found Yi Shiwen. However, she hadn't expected that he could be so powerful. It was simply beyond her imagination. Everyone was shocked. They had wished for Yi Zaiwen's success from the bottom of their hearts. However, they hadn't thought that he would be able to succeed. Yi Shiwen felt several gazes on him after he had obtained the city and placed it inside the heavenly source mirror. They turned out to be the members of his team. The eyes of the black-robed old Een brimmed with resentment and despair as he looked at Yi Shiwen. He had witnessed Yi Zaiwen's performance. So, he now knew that he might not be a match for this confident and fearless young man even if he were to mount a sneak attack on him. Gong Yanjia also looked at Yi Shiwen. He had a strong sense of alertness in his eyes and a somewhat violent expression on his face. Yi Shiwen smiled at them and revealed his pure white teeth. His teeth were shining brightly. However, it wasn't so in the opinion of the members of the small team who possessed ulterior motives. In fact, they felt that Yi Shiwen was as dreadful as a phantom that had crawled out of the hell, even with his handsome face and sunny smile. They couldn't help but tremble in fear. That outstanding, young and seemingly naive Saiyan figure looked out of place in this bloody sky which was filled with corpses and blood. Alright, it's time for us to leave for that tomb since those demon beasts have turned back. We may not be able to show up there early. However, there is no harm in letting others do the exploration first. Gong Yanjia was the first one to react. He opened his mouth and spoke up. His hoarse voice had become even more unpleasant after the battle. It sounded like the voice of an old crow now. He usually looked unpleasant due to his ugly facial features and abnormal body. However, everyone suddenly felt that he looked much more pleasing to the eye than Yi Shiwen. After all, he hadn't defeated an army of demon beasts single-handedly. However, Yi Shiwen was somewhat surprised by Gong Yanjia's mild reaction. An ordinary person would have gotten majorly affected after watching him defeat an army of demon beasts. It wasn't that Gong Yanjia's complexion had remained unchanged. However, it seemed that he was merely wary and nothing more. He wasn't terrified. This wasn't a normal thing for Yi Shiwen. Does he have a trump card up his sleeves? Gong Yanjia also seemed to be analyzing him at this time. Undoubtedly, Gong Yanjia posed the biggest threat to him in this team. In fact, Yi Shiwen had attacked comprehensively in order to intimidate everyone. Yi Shiwen wasn't worried about what these people were scheming behind his back at the moment. However, it obviously wasn't a good thing if there was always someone scheming against him. It looked like Yi Shiwen hadn't fully achieved his goal of frightening them. Everyone agreed with Gong Yanjia's suggestion. After all, these people had come specifically for obtaining the secret that was hidden inside the tomb. In fact, most of them couldn't even think of getting into the top 10 positions for inheriting the heritages of great building. It was obvious that that contest would be even more intense. The team didn't delay further and proceeded in the direction of the legendary tomb. They came across an increasing number of demon beasts along the way. Those beasts were getting increasingly concentrated as they moved toward the tomb, which was located in the depths of the Great Gas Collar. However, fortunately they hadn't come across an army of demon beasts again till now. Otherwise, they would have had to face great difficulty in moving ahead. Even Yi Shiwen didn't want to face them again since it would be too troublesome. However, the most terrifying thing that could happen was that they could come across a Demon King level commander. There would be no problem if they just had to fight an ordinary demon commander. However, it would be too bad for them if a demon king of sage-accomplished realm confronted them. In fact, no one apart from Yi Shiwen could dare to say that they would surely come out alive in such a case. Yi Zaiwen's speed was the fastest in this team. It seemed that he was willingly serving as the brave vanguard of the team. Moreover, he even went ahead while slaughtering all the demon beasts in their path. Everyone had come to know how terrifying Yi Zaiwen's slaughtering efficiency was. In fact, there was no difference between a single demon beast and a group of demon beasts in front of him. Master, Yi Shiwen may turn out to be the most unexpected part in Master's plan. He may become the biggest obstacle for Master when the time comes. We must eliminate him before it's too late. The black-robed old In's eyes were full of hatred and desire for revenge as he looked towards Yi Shiwen. He was the one who hated Yi Shiwen the most. One would have jumped in fear if they had heard the black-robed old In address Gong Yanjia as master. Everyone in the team believed that the black-robed old In was a helper whom Gong Yanjia had found. However, their relationship was much different than what they had imagined. It doesn't matter. He has certainly proved to be beyond my expectation. However, he can still become a good pawn if used properly. Gong Yanjia coldly replied. His ugly face looked sinister as he let out an evil grin. He's like an ant in my eyes. And I'll crush him to death if he dares to jump around. Gong Yanjia looked towards Yi Shiwen with his ice-cold vision and said. His gaze looked indifferent and ruthless. It seemed as if he was looking at a dead person. However, he soon went back to his former alert expression. I'll crush you to death when you'll be of no use to me. Everyone was anxious. Everyone had their own ulterior motives. So, nobody had noticed the communication between Gong Yanjia's and the black-robed old In's divine senses. Yi Shiwen, Gong Yanjia and that old In were looking at you when they were communicating through their divine senses. They are probably scheming something against you. Yi Mo suddenly reminded Yi Shiwen. Yi Zaiwen's hand had transformed into a handsword. A set of simple sword techniques had displayed incredibly might on being used by his bare hands. The demon beasts that had come in his path had been cut into two halves by him bare-handed. And they had then been absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. Yi Zaiwen's team members might have been thinking of him as a resource that was doing the hard and brave work of being a vanguard. However, he didn't think so. After all, the blood essences and inner cores of the demon beasts that he had been killing were being absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. And the heavenly source mirror had been becoming stronger bit by bit as a result. This meant that he had also been becoming stronger. So, he wasn't doing some laborious and meritorious deed as far as he was concerned. Scheming against me? Yi Zaiwen's expression turned ice-cold. He was certainly aware of the fact that everyone in this team harbored ulterior motives. After all, a team wouldn't add people to its ranks in such a casual manner. However, his choice had been proven to be correct. After all, he might not have heard of this tomb if he hadn't joined this team. He had obviously been able to gather much less information about the Great Gas Collar as compared to most of the other people because of the interruption caused by King Tai. Yi Shiwen could at most trust Ding Tong in the entire team. The black-robed old Yin and Gong Yanjia harbored a great resentment for him. Therefore, they couldn't be trusted in any way. The black-robed old Yin hated Yi Shiwen because Yi Shiwen had killed his brother, while Gong Yanjia hated him because he was a threat to his command over the team. Therefore, these two men's attitude wasn't very nice towards Yi Shiwen. Now both of them had gathered. So what Yi Mo had said had to be true. After all, what else could they be doing if they weren't scheming against him? I had anticipated this. These two have been dying to get rid of me. They certainly won't give up easily. Yi Shiwen coldly smiled and said, Gong Yanjia has a hidden strength which he hasn't revealed yet. He obviously thinks that he can destroy my hidden strength using his own. However, that won't work. The highest strength that is allowed inside the Great Gas Collar is the strength of the Sage Accomplished Realm. An ordinary Sage Great Perfection level expert won't last against such incredible strength. However, I can easily escape a Sage Accomplished level expert even if I can't beat them. Moreover, I have the Blood Slave. The Blood Slave has deeply integrated into the body of the Star Colossus. It will come in handy sooner or later. And the schemes of these people will only turn out to be wishful thinking once that happens. However, I mustn't fall into any trap. Yi Shiwen could escape even from the hands of a great sage expert. But he couldn't be considered invincible in this Great Gas Collar as per his current strength. However, he didn't need to worry about self-protection. He still couldn't use the body of that Star Colossus. At present, the Blood Slave could display the strength of the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm using the body of the Star Colossus. However, this was against the rules of the Great Gas Collar. So, it might get obliterated if it appeared. Moreover, the Blood Slave was an external entity and wasn't the original soul of this Star Colossus. Their agreement still looked distant since it hadn't reached to a sufficient level. Consequently, the Blood Slave was incapable of suppressing the strength of the Star Colossus down to Sage Accomplished level. Therefore, it couldn't be brought into use unless he went out of the Great Gas Collar. But he at least didn't need to worry about self-protection. Therefore, whatever those two men had been scheming against him was only wishful thinking, nothing more. However, these two men are a pain in the butt. The killing intention soared in Yi Zaiwen's heart. He wouldn't show any mercy if and when he would face these two men that were scheming against him. Regardless of what ulterior motives everyone in this team had in their hearts, they had finally arrived in front of a huge mountain range after traveling for half-month. The mountain range was covered with Yin energy clouds. And these clouds were producing shrieking and howling sounds. Chapter 557. The mountain range appeared to be endless. One couldn't see its boundary. It had seemed great and boundless at first. However, it seemed gloomy and horrific now. There was danger lurking at every corner. Moreover, it had been locked up by the vast dark clouds. So, there was gloom all around the place. There wasn't even a trace of daylight. Moreover, the shrieks of some strange creatures which definitely weren't beasts were coming from the mountains from time to time. And these sounds were enough to scare everyone. Hoo 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 hoo. Bursts of evil wind came from inside the mountain and blew against everyone's body. The gloomy and bone-chilling wind made everyone shiver. Each of these experts had profound cultivation. However, they still shivered as the chill wind caressed their bodies. However, they weren't shivering because it was cold. In fact, their cultivation would allow them to move freely even in an environment with temperature of hundreds of degrees below zero. They were shivering because of the chilling yin energy that was piercing their souls. This soul-piercing yin energy was emanating from the mountains. Moreover, they could sense the presence of the undead creatures that were lurking in the mountain range. Could it be that this place has given birth to a lot of undead creatures? Yi Shiwen secretly pondered. He was familiar with these undead creatures. He had witnessed countless tyrannical undead creatures during his trip to the Demon Island. In fact, he hadn't forgotten the roars and shrieks of those undead creatures till now. Gong Yanjia's voice sounded like that of an old crow. But the roars of these undead creatures sounded like the combination of all the unpleasant sounds in the world. And these strange and sharp sounds were making everyone tremble with fear. Yi Zaiwen's conjecture was very much possible. After all, this was probably the tomb of a great powerhouse. And the birth of some undead creatures in the presence of such an extremely gloomy yin environment was a normal thing. Is the graveyard located inside this mountain range? Yi Zaiwen's divine sense swept out and flowed into Ding Tong's ears. He expected Ding Tong to be aware about the key locations since she had invited him on this trip. Other than that, one could also get some idea about the various key spots from the big outlined map of the Great Gas Collar. The Great Gas Collar had opened many times before. Therefore, many places had already been explored by the people. Yi Shiwen had also thought of obtaining a map. However, he unfortunately hadn't gotten the time to do so since King Tai had disrupted his plan. That's right. This mountain range is known as Evil Corpse Mountain Range. Undead creatures are present everywhere in these mountains. Initially, there was a rumor that this mountain range could be the most evil place in the entire Great Gas Collar. It has been formed after the convergence of all the negative yin energies of the Great Gas Collar. In fact, I've heard that this place used to be a battlefield, and many experts had been slaughtered at this ancient battlefield. However, the resentful souls of those dead experts weren't ready to leave at that time. So, they had gathered and formed this Evil Corpse Mountain Range. There are many other rumors apart from this. It turns into a very dangerous place every time the Great Gas Collar opens. I will provide you with a map of this place. Ding Tong replied. She then used her divine sense to pass on a map of the Great Gas Collar to Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen absorbed the entire map in his mind in an instant. And he got an overall idea about the Great Gas Collar as a result. Now, his knowledge on this matter wasn't vague like it used to be. In fact, it seemed as if the fog that had blurred his vision had suddenly disappeared. This map was certainly incomplete. However, it was sufficient for Yi Shiwen. He found some records regarding the Evil Corpse Mountain Range when he carefully looked at the map. However, the map's author hadn't clarified the main reasons clearly. He had only written some rumors and some predictions. Moreover, the map didn't seem to have the correct inferences. However, someone had accidentally found the tomb's exit when the Great Gas Collar had opened last time. It had revealed the true colors of this Evil Corpse Mountain Range. It was an underground burial site that stretched up to thousands of miles. It's reckoned that the perennial presence of negative yin energy has slowly evolved this mountain range into such a gloomy place. And the corpses of the creatures that had died in these giant mountains have also transformed into zombies over the years. Ding Tong said, "Everyone, that tomb is inside this mountain range. You must be careful because this sinister mist contains the poisonous miasma of corpses." Gong Yanjia said. It seemed that everyone had understood clearly. In fact, everyone already knew something or the other about this place through various means. They were going to face a deadly situation. So, how could they possibly have come unprepared? However, Yi Shiwen had recently become aware of this place. So, he didn't know much about it. A protective layer of real elemental energy appeared on everyone's body. It wrapped them up. It didn't matter whether it was the evil energy of the corpses, the poisonous corpses themselves, the various kinds of malignant influences, or the negative energies. Nothing could come close to them. They hadn't gone too far into the evil corpse mountain range. However, they had started to fear this place once again because the superficial protective layer of real elemental energy on their bodies had begun to issue crackling sounds. The protective layer was being corroded by the poisonous miasma of the corpses. And the speed of corrosion was extremely quick. Fortunately, they had profound cultivations. An ordinary semi-sage expert in their place would have gotten corroded to death by now if they had entered this place. Even an ordinary sage-level expert couldn't stay here for long. Rustle! Rustle! Suddenly, countless withered vines issued rustling sounds as they appeared in the sky from all directions. They then swept out towards everyone. It seemed that they intended to bind everyone's bodies and drag them away. Everyone looked closely. It turned out to be a dozen or so trees which had come from a dead tree forest located far away. Those trees contained countless withered vines, and these withered vines had stretched to more than a dozen miles in the sky in order to attack the team. Damn it! It's pregnant corpse tree. Gu Tian clenched his teeth and secretly cursed. Then his hand moved at a lightning speed, and he broke down a vine. However, he had become extremely depressed in his heart. A terrified expression had appeared on everyone's face. There were no normal creatures inside this evil corpse mountain range. Even the plants were monstrous. These pregnant corpse trees were present everywhere. And they were extremely terrifying. They used to drag away living creatures and absorb their entire blood essence. And those creatures would transform into dried-up corpses as a result. Moreover, the deceased would transform into zombies after they had remained under the influence of the evil Yin wind for hundreds of years. But they would be able to escape after they had transformed into zombies. This was the reason these trees were known as pregnant corpse trees. Everyone became extremely terrified when they thought about these trees that gave birth to zombies. Fortunately, these trees were still more than a dozen miles away from the team. Otherwise, they would have landed into an enormous trouble. Everyone scattered one after another. They broke down the vines and quickly flew away from this place. This evil corpse mountain range is extremely strange. It's hard to say how many formidable and grotesque creatures this place has. Many experts of Sage Peak Realm and even Sage Small Perfection Realm must have died at this place. We must be extremely careful. Gong Yanjia's expression turned dignified. He had put down the thought of scheming against Yi Shiwen for the time being. After all, there were much more dreadful things to be worried about right now. He would be able to scheme against Yi Shiwen only if he lived. Gong Yanjia, you must have some information about this evil corpse mountain range since you are the one who is spearheading this operation. You must have a detailed map as well. Take it out, and let us have a look. You must let us know what we are dealing with. Yi Shiwen indifferently said. Yi Shiwen had already come to know about this place from Ding Tong. Ding Tong, Yu Rei, Gong Yanjia, and Xiao Yuan were the 4 founding members of this team. However, Gong Yanjia had spearheaded this operation. He was the chief planner. So, it wasn't possible that he hadn't prepared for it. In fact, no one would believe it if they were told that Gong Yanjia hadn't prepared for the operation. Naturally, everyone's gaze fell on Gong Yanjia. They also knew that Gong Yanjia had spearheaded this operation. And they also knew about this weird evil corpse mountain range. It could be said that there was danger everywhere. They wouldn't have been worried if they didn't know anything about this place. However, that wasn't the case. But it was obvious that Gong Yanjia must have prepared for this place. So he must have a map as well. And it would become difficult for him and these people to work together if he didn't take it out for everyone to see. Anyway, nobody wanted to die. So, who wouldn't want to have something that could increase the odds of their survival? Gong Yanjia shot a glance at Yi Shiwen. and an intermittent killing intention appeared in his eyes. Obviously, each of these people possessed ulterior motives. The reason why he had formed such a team was that he wanted to survive by using them as cannon fodder. He had planned to kill them after using them since he wouldn't have any problems then. After all, could a dead person hold him accountable for anything? However, he was faced with an unavoidable issue at this time. After all, this team of people who already possessed ulterior motives might become even more disunited if he didn't speak up. Audacious! What do you think of yourself? The black-robed old Een opened his mouth and said, "Young Master Gong Yen is the leader of our team. It's fine if he keeps the map with himself. We just have to follow him, that's all." However, everyone in the team superciliously looked at him as soon as his voice faded away. There wouldn't have been any problem if everyone in this small team was of one mind. However, everyone clearly knew what was going on. Gong Yenjia got a headache because of this. In fact, he was having doubts about his plan. Have I made a mistake in my plan? I shouldn't have found such extremely troublesome people to be used as cannon fodders. What do you think of yourself? Who said you could speak now? Yi Shiwen looked at the black-robed old Een with his ice-cold vision. He didn't conceal his killing intention. And everyone could see it in his eyes. He wouldn't mind crushing the black-robed old Een to death if that person wanted to fight. Yi Shiwen wasn't prepared. However, the opposite party wasn't prepared either. Therefore, it would be better to strike first and gain the upper hand by catching the opposite party by surprise instead of giving them a chance to prepare and rise in revolt. Otherwise, God knows when he would lead him into danger. Obviously, the other people were also thinking this. After all, everyone was distrustful. They were initially hesitant about whether they should speak or not. However, they weren't worried about anything now since Yi Shiwen had spoke up. They could also clearly see this time that the team was divided into two factions. One faction belonged to Yi Shiwen, while the other belonged to Gong Yenjia. Both of these individuals were exceptionally fierce. They wouldn't stand any nonsense. "I won't mind sending you to join your brother in hell if you are so eager to die," Yi Shiwen said in a deep voice. Everyone became chilled to the bone as they heard this since they recalled how easily Yi Shiwen had defeated the white-robed old Yang. Gong Yenjia took a deep breath while facing everyone's gaze. Then he said, "I don't want to keep the map to myself. We all belong to the same team, so we must be of one mind. I would like everyone to see the map that I have in store." Chapter 558. Gong Yenjia waved his big hand, and it transformed into a map in the sky. It was the map of Evil Corpse Mountain Range. A few dangerous spots that had been previously explored by people were marked on this map. Yi Shiwen knew that Gong Yenjia hadn't shown the complete version of the map. Even so, Yi Shiwen had gotten a better idea of the Evil Corpse Mountain Range. Therefore, he wasn't in the dark like he used to be. After all, he didn't even know where to go some time ago. Yi Shiwen couldn't help being emotional. What was the worth of heritage? Those with solid heritage would always be much superior to a random cultivator with no background. After all, they had come from a deemed sect and possessed an inheritance as a result. It was the same as the children of officials and entrepreneurs in his previous life. An ordinary person wouldn't be able to compete with them even if the competition was fair. After all, the starting point wasn't the same for elites and commoners. Yi Shiwen was far away from the true martial world at this time. So, he couldn't enjoy the resources and information that had been accumulated for thousands of years by the true martial world. So, there was no difference between him and a random cultivator with no background at the moment. Gong Yenjia had revealed enough information for him at a time when he was in the dark. Everyone became relaxed after they had seen the map. And they didn't complain after that. "Yi Shiwen, this map may not be too reliable." Guillemot said, "Maybe not. But it's still much better than being in the dark." Yi Shiwen replied. Everyone flew into the depths of the Evil Corpse Mountain Range after the map's issue had been resolved. They could frequently see experts like themselves rushing into the depths of Evil Corpse Mountain Range. It was obvious that all of them had obtained the news about the depths of the Evil Corpse Mountain Range. Most of these experts were at the Sage Small Perfection realm. However, there was no shortage of Sage Great Perfection level experts among them. They might not be as formidable as Yi Shiwen and the other people of this team. However, they weren't weak either. Their teams also fought several battles. Some battles were against the few other teams, while some were against the zombies that were wandering inside the Evil Corpse mountain range. The human experts and demon beasts that had transformed into zombies after their death were also present among these zombies. Everyone had become scared when they had seen this scene for the first time. These zombies were very formidable. However, they weren't scared of these zombies. Instead, they were scared of this Evil Corpse mountain range since it could turn exceptional powerhouses into mindless zombies. There had been a very few cases in normal places wherein an ordinary person had transformed into zombies after their death. After all, it was possible only at the right place and under the right circumstances. However, it was a completely different deal at this place. This place was rich in the negative Yin energy, and this negative energy could directly transform the powerhouses into zombies upon their death. Roar! Suddenly, a roar came from under the ground where everyone was standing. A big hand swept out of the ground and moved towards Yi Ziwen's foot to grab it. It was an incomparably pale and rough hand. Yi Shiwen didn't hesitate to stamp down his feet. The ground shattered in an instant, and cracks opened in the surrounding space. That big hand suffered a fracture. However, Yi Shiwen became somewhat speechless. He was amazed by the hardness of this hand. He knew well that he possessed tyrannical strength. It wouldn't be an overstatement if it was said that he could easily crush a mountain. However, this hand had withstood his strength. It had only suffered a fracture. This was a miracle. This proved that these zombies had very tough bodies. They were still very difficult to deal with. Yi Shiwen had understood that these zombies were very ferocious during his time on the Demon Island. Moreover, they were outside the bindings of the 3 realms and 5 elements. It could be said that these zombies were the very definition of trouble. These zombies were different from the zombies that had been ordinary people before transformation. These zombies were extremely powerful experts before their deaths. Some of them had been sage experts before their death. Therefore, these zombies would be even more troublesome. However, Yi Shiwen had merely thought about this. His actions hadn't slowed down because of these thoughts. He stamped his foot and released a very incredible force downwards. The entire ground trembled. His golden divinities permeated into the ground and shattered the zombie that had been preparing to mount a sneak attack on him. These zombies were the most troublesome. It was clear that this zombie used to be an expert who had arrived to explore this place, but had died instead. And his corpse had transformed into a zombie thereafter. Everyone felt a little bad for that expert after realizing this. After all, they had also arrived here to explore like him. They also wanted to obtain that legendary secret. Everyone continued to move ahead. They came across the surprise attacks of a few zombies from time to time. All of these zombies were very powerful. Even a Sage Great Perfection level zombie appeared once. These experts had to collaborate in order to resist that zombie. However, it still had been very hard for them to resist it. Finally, Yi Shiwen timely moved into action and took down that zombie. These zombies must have been powerful when they were alive. However, now they were just a bunch of walking corpses that had no soul or consciousness. These zombies would have given birth to resentful spirits within themselves if they were to be placed in the outside world. And thus, they would become another kind of intelligent creatures. However, it seemed that their resentful spirits had been suppressed by the great gas collar. So, there was no sign of such phenomenon. It seemed that they were acting on their instincts. These zombies were wandering alone. However, they were present in abundance. In fact, there were too many of them. This team possessed incredible strength, but it still took them 3 full days to reach the depths of the Evil Corpse mountain range where the huge tomb was situated. The entrance to the huge tomb was surrounded by candle lamps. It seemed that they had been burning since ancient times. They had been burning since countless years, and still there was no sign of them being extinguished. Yi Shiwen felt a chill by just looking at that green glow. Luxurious, it's so extravagant. Yemo said. These candles have been ignited from the corpse oil of above Great Sage Realm zombies. Therefore, they haven't blown out even though they had been ignited thousands of years ago. The zombies are beyond the 3 realms and 5 elements. And the corpse oil in their bodies has such characteristics. Those small zombies that are outside won't dare to come close because these candles have been ignited from the corpse oil of Great Sage level zombies. Yemo explained. Use the corpse oil to ignite the candles that guard against the corpses? Yi Shiwen felt numb. Yi Shiwen nodded. Not a single zombie pursued them after they had entered the vicinity of this place. It was evident that they were afraid of this place. Yi Shiwen also noticed that all the tyrannical auras that he had been sensing up until now had been lurking at this place since everyone was waiting for the tomb to open. Probing visions immediately appeared after the arrival of Yi Shiwen and his team. Obviously, their attitude wasn't good towards these people who had arrived to compete with them. Humph! Gong Yanjia coldly snorted and shattered the probing visions and divine senses. He occupied a place and began to wait in silence. Yi Shiwen and the other people didn't say anything. Their map had indicated that this must be the entrance of the tomb. This was a time to recover for them. They had consumed too much real elemental energy while killing those zombies on the way. However, these things weren't enough to make Yi Shiwen worried. These people were undoubtedly ferocious. However, they were only at the Sage Great Perfection realm. So, he wasn't afraid of any of them. Several masters of matrix formations were unceasingly trying to break down the tomb's pre-installed matrix formation which was laid down in its front. A team of dozens of people came from the sky treading on their flying lights. They were headed by a man. He stood holding a sword. He was dressed in a magnificent robe and had bright and handsome facial features. He appeared to be around 20 years old. Drops of green-colored blood slid down from the tip of his sword. It was the blood of those zombies. It was clear that he had recently killed some zombies. He looked very intimidating. The young man cast away the several men that were behind him after he landed. He then confronted those masters of matrix formation and asked, "What's wrong? Why have you still not cracked it?" "Young lord, this matrix formation is very hard to crack. However, we should be able to crack it within half day's time." One of the masters of matrix formation turned around and replied, "You people are useless. You're so slow," that man resentfully snorted and said. His imposing aura permeated the surroundings at the same time. He was an expert of Sage Accomplished Realm. His imposing aura contained a warning for the experts that were staring at him. A Sage Accomplished level expert possessed more tyrannical strength than an expert of Sage Great Perfection Realm. In fact, a Sage Accomplished level expert could take on a bunch of Sage Great Perfection level experts at once. However, there weren't only a few experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm present on the scene. Instead, groups of such experts were arriving one after another. And there were many experts of beyond Sage Great Perfection Realm among them too. Who is this arrogant man? Yi Shiwen frowned and looked at that man who had brashly unleashed his aura. This Tang Ken is extremely arrogant. Is he intending to deter us all? Someone resentfully said. However, his voice appeared weak. It seemed that he was afraid of Tang Ken. It doesn't matter. There's nothing to be afraid of, even if he is at the Sage Accomplished Realm. He must know that we are large in number. He can't deter us alone. Another person seemed equally undeterred. Does he think that nobody will dare to compete with him for the sacred spring of life? And he thinks too highly of himself if that's what he believes. Moreover, it isn't clear how many experts are eyeing him at present. He himself is a big target. It's just that he hasn't realized this, that's all. It's certainly going to be a bloody battle when the time comes. Let those top experts fight. We will take advantage of the chaos. Some people were planning to take advantage of the chaos. Various conversations were happening via divine senses. In fact, the wavelengths of these conversations had filled the sky. Those mixed noises seemed unbearable. Yi Shiwen grabbed all those floating discussions and filtered them. And he eventually found some useful information as a result. This Tang Ken could be considered a very popular person in this operation. Many people have been planning to deal with him. However, the reason isn't he himself. Instead, it is his brother. His brother was the one who had obtained the secret that could promote one to Great Sage Realm when the Great Gas Collar had opened last time. Consequently, he had become an expert of Great Sage Realm later. And that so-called secret is this sacred spring of life. That you're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.